Fleece and Brimstone. 100-year-old contract. One chaos demon. One llama-shifter trying to run a trekking business. By Win Valentine. Copyright 2026 by Win Valentine. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. Chapter 1. What Astrid Halvorsen Left Me. Astrid Halvorsen had been dead 6 months when her granddaughter finally walked up the stairs above the post office to read the will. The first document on Anders Petrescu's desk was Astrid's last testament. The second was a piece of brown-edged paper dated 1924. Maren sat down without taking her coat off. Anders did not ask her to. He had read enough wills to know that some things needed doing with a coat on. Besides, the cast-iron radiator had been pinging twice and going silent for the last 15 minutes, and she had not yet decided whether the office was warm or cold. "I'm sorry it took me this long," she said. 6 months is not long, Miss Halvorsen. I have an estate on my docket I'm still working through from the Carter administration. Halvorsen Pack runs March through October. I couldn't get to it in trekking season. In Tokmai, he said. Romanian, Maren remembered, for just so. He had used the word once in her childhood, in this same office, after her grandmother had said something self-evident. Through the window, the foghorn on the harbor sounded twice. Anders adjusted his glasses, picked up the testament, and began. The cannery. The converted oyster cannery on the bluff that Astrid had bought cheap in 1957 went to Maren. The barn and tack room and the bunkhouse cottage and the half-acre of bluff grass that ran out to the cliff edge, all to Maren. Halvorsen Pack Trekking, its name, its grazing easements, its booking calendar, its current and future contracts, to Maren. Otto the pack llama and the other 11 pack animals, including Wendell, the most belligerent wether on the west coast, also to Maren, with a note in Astrid's hand that read, "Good luck with that one." Maren had known all of this would happen. She was the eldest grandchild. She was also, by an enormous margin, the only Halvorsen with the patience for a spreadsheet. Birger lived in his truck. Sigrid lived wherever she was sleeping that week. Aunt Tova lived on her own piece of bluff land 2 coves north and had retired from active operations the year Astrid's hip stopped cooperating. There was no one else to inherit. Maren had not known about the second document. Anders set the testament down and picked up the second piece of paper. It had been folded into thirds for 102 years, which had given it 3 permanent creases and 1 slight wrinkle on the bottom edge, where someone had once held it longer than necessary. The ink was iron gall, brown-black instead of the modern blue-black, and on the right margin, in pencil that should have faded by now and had not, there were notes in a teenage girl's handwriting. "This is the part," Anders said, "where I tell you something I have been waiting 6 months to tell you." The radiator pinged. Maren did not move. "Your grandmother executed a second instrument during her lifetime. It was registered with my predecessor in 1924 and has remained on file in this office every year since. It is a binding contract." A contract. A binding contract. With one Ignatius Cantwell. Age, on the document, not listed. Address, on the document, not listed. Maren looked at the radiator instead of at Anders, because looking at the radiator was easier. The radiator pinged a 3rd time. "What kind of contract?" she said. Anders read it aloud. He read everything, letter by letter, slowly, as if opening a window and making sure no draft got in. The contract had 11 clauses, Most of them were standard for the era and would have meant something to a person who lived in 1924 and meant very little to Maren now. 3 of them mattered. Clause 1. Ignatius Cantwell, having executed an action on Astrid Halvorsen's behalf in the autumn of 1924, owed Astrid Halvorsen a debt of equivalent weight to be collected upon her death. Clause 2. For the duration of the debt collection period, Ignatius Cantwell was to reside in Halloran's Tide on Halvorsen family property and to do no harm. Clause 3. The debt would be considered satisfied when Ignatius Cantwell had understood what his action in 1924 had cost. The determination of understanding was at the sole discretion of the contracting party. The contracting party was Astrid Halvorsen. The contracting party was dead. Maren waited for Anders to keep reading. He stopped. "That's it?" she said. "There is also a postscript in your grandmother's hand. It reads, 'I forgive him. I just need to know he understands. It is not part of the operative text.'" She read it twice. The handwriting was unmistakably Astrid's, which was a thing Maren knew the moment she saw it, because she had grown up addressing envelopes in Astrid's handwriting from the time she was 6. Astrid had written the postscript in pencil. Astrid had written everything else in iron gall, which meant she had thought about the contract for a longer time than she had thought about the postscript, which meant the postscript was newer. Maren did not know how much newer. "Anders." "Yes." "My grandmother is dead. But my grandmother had a contract with a person named Ignatius Cantwell, who is alive in 1924, and possibly also now. And the contract requires this person to live on my property until he understands a thing that my grandmother is no longer here to certify he has understood." "Yes." "Anders." "Mr. Cantwell," Anders said, "has been notified. He arrives tomorrow." The pencil postscript caught the radiator's light and held it. Maren let her coat slide off her shoulders. She was warm now. It had not happened slowly. It had happened all at once, which was how bodies on the trail registered cold turning back into not cold, not by degrees, but at the moment the body remembered it had ever been warm. "He's a person." "He is a contracting party," Anders said. "I am not in the habit of speculating about what else he is." "You know what else he is." "I do not. I know what your grandmother wrote about him in the margins of this document, which is not the same thing." "What did she write?" Anders turned the paper. There were 3 margin notes in Astrid's teenage hand. The first read, "Do no harm because you have to do no harm." The second read, "Do not pretend you do not know what you did." The third read, "I will know." The handwriting on the third one was harder than the first 2. Astrid had pressed the pencil down on the will until the wood under it had broken a little. "She was 18 years old when she signed this," Anders said. "I do not know what she had in mind. I know what she put on the page." Maren did not pick the contract up yet. She looked at it. The brown-black ink and the broken pencil line on will, the signature on the lower right, Ignatius Cantwell's, written cleanly in iron gall in a hand that had not been hurried. The signature was the only thing on the page that had not aged. The paper had yellowed, the ink had darkened, the pencil had pressed through. Ignatius Cantwell's signature looked as if it had been put on the paper yesterday. "Where does he stay?" she said. "The contract specifies family property. Astrid and I discussed it the year before she died. She intended for him to live in the bunkhouse cottage. Aunt Tove knows about this." Aunt Tove has known about this since 1962, when Astrid took her aside one morning and explained that she had once made a bargain on the family's behalf that she did not intend to make twice. Aunt Tove has not discussed it with anyone else, as far as I am aware. She has the original margin notes memorized, which I find admirable. Maren did not laugh, exactly. She let air out of her nose and looked at the window. The foghorn went twice. The radiator pinged once and went quiet. My cousins do not know. It is your decision whether to tell them. Bryony does not know. That is also your decision. What does the law say happens if I refuse to honor it? Anders considered her. He did not consider her unkindly. He waited until the radiator pinged once more before answering, which was a thing she would remember later for reasons she could not yet articulate. The contract was executed by your grandmother under her own legal capacity, he said. It does not bind you. It binds Mr. Cantwell. You are not required to allow him onto your property. You are not required to allow him into the cottage. If you do not allow it, the contract enters a different stage, which I do not have the authority to interpret because the contract is not a document my office has jurisdiction over. I have held it on behalf of the contracting party. The contracting party is your grandmother. Your grandmother has left it to you. You're telling me I can throw him out? I am telling you that the document does not require you to throw him out, nor to keep him. I am telling you what your grandmother wrote. I am telling you what your grandmother did not write. Maren looked at the postscript again. I forgive him. I just need to know he understands. Astrid never forgave anyone for anything, she said. She forgave one person for one thing, and she wrote it down in pencil in 1962. How do you know it was 1962? Because I was 19 years old that summer, and I delivered the codicil to my predecessor's office myself. And your grandmother gave me a piece of pie. Maren did not say anything for a while. Anders did not push. Through the window, the ferry whistle sounded once, long, which meant the 4 o'clock boat had cleared the breakwater. She had grown up with that whistle. She had timed her chores by it as a child. She was aware that she had stopped timing her grief by it, an awareness she did not entirely want. I'd like to read the contract. It is yours to read. She reached for it. Anders did not hand it to her so much as turn it on the desk and slide it across. The paper was light, as folded paper goes after 100 years, but it had not torn at the creases. Maren noticed. She had handled enough old maps to know what folded paper did when it was loved badly and what it did when it was loved well. This paper had been loved well. She held it by its corners. She had been taught to hold old paper by its corners by her grandmother, who had been taught by her grandmother before, and which was the same reason Astrid had been able to keep a teenage pencil note legible for 102 years. You held the paper at the corners, and you did not lay it flat on a surface that had been wet that day, and you did not stack things on it, and you did not, under any circumstances, fold it a fourth time. Maren's thumbs were on the upper corners. Her index fingers were on the lower corners. The paper sat suspended between her hands. The ink in the signature on the lower right caught the light from the window. Ignatius Cantwell's signature was put on the paper in iron gall and had not faded a hair in a century. It would not be faded tomorrow. It would not be faded the day after. The pencil postscript caught the same light and almost looked like it was warm. What time does he arrive? She said. He will be on the 4 o'clock ferry tomorrow. All right. Maren. All right, Anders. I heard you. I'll meet him. Anders nodded once and stood and walked to the side table by the wall and poured her a small glass of brandy without asking her, which was a thing he did at the end of every will reading he had ever conducted in this office, and which Maren had not known until today. She drank the brandy. The radiator pinged twice and held. She set the glass down. She still had the contract by its corners. She looked at the page one last time before she put it back on the desk, and what she noticed, what she would not stop noticing for the rest of the afternoon, was a small dark mark on the lower edge of the contract where someone had once held the paper longer than necessary. The mark was on the lower right corner. The corner was where a right-handed person would have held the paper after signing it. The mark was a thumbprint. The thumbprint was small. The thumbprint was Astrid's. Maren held the contract a moment more. The corners did not bend. The paper had been treated, for 102 years, by people who knew how to hold it. She set it down on Anders's desk, lining up the bottom edge with the bottom of the blotter, and she did not let it go all at once. She let it go in 2 stages, as Astrid had taught her to let go of any piece of paper she did not want to harm. 1 hand at a time. The radiator pinged. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," Anders said. She walked back down the stairs with her coat over her arm and the brandy in her chest, and Halvorsen pack trekking newly hers, and a 102-year-old contract sitting on Anders Petrescu's desk above the post office. And she did not, for the entire walk back to her truck, think about Ignatius Cantwell at all. She thought about a thumbprint. Chapter 2. Mr. Cantwell arrives. A man in a brown coat was walking up the road from the ferry. Maren had been bracing all afternoon. He was holding his suitcase by its sides, not its handle. She had been splitting kindling on the porch of the office for an hour and a half to make sure her hands had something to do when the ferry came in. She had split more kindling than the cannery would need for the rest of the spring. She heard the 4 o'clock whistle from the bluff, and then 12 minutes later she watched a single passenger get off the boat at the dock, refuse a ride from Bryony's brother, and start the walk up the hill on foot. The walk took 18 minutes. Maren split kindling for 14 of them. She put the hatchet down when he turned in at the gate. He was unremarkable. That was the first thing she registered. She had pictured someone dramatic, tall perhaps, or dressed badly on purpose, or visibly wrong in a manner the eye could not look at. And instead what she got was a man in his late 30s, possibly his early 40s, possibly older, in a brown wool coat that had been bought at least twice. His hair was brown. His eyes were a color she could not pin. The suitcase was leather and old, and held closed by a single strap. He was carrying it by its sides. He stopped 4 feet from the porch. "Halvorsen," he said. "Yes." "Ignatius Cantwell. People who like me call me Nate." "Did Anders Petrescu tell you when the ferry—" "He told me the 4 o'clock would put me here at 1:30. I am a little late because I walked." "I can see that." He set the suitcase down on the gravel. He set it down on its side, not its bottom, which Maren found herself filing away under things to ask Anders about later. And then he straightened and looked at her without doing anything else with his face. She was aware that she had not been looked at, like this, by anyone, in a long time. Astrid had looked at her like this. Astrid had been the only one. "I'm Maren," she said. "I know." "All right. Where would you like me to put the suitcase?" She had thought about this for 6 hours. She had thought about it from when she finished her coffee at the kitchen table that morning until the moment the ferry blew its whistle, and she had not arrived at an answer she liked. She had arrived at an answer she could live with. She gestured up the path toward the bluff. "There's a cottage. My grandmother had it built in 1958 for guests. I haven't kept it. There's a bed in it and a kettle and a hot plate and a small bath. The plumbing works some of the time." "Some of the time." "There is a thing about the plumbing in this cottage that I am not going to explain to you on your first afternoon. The plumbing works some of the time. If it doesn't work, you can use the bath in the office." "Understood. Follow me, please." She picked up the basket of kindling. He picked up the suitcase by its sides. They walked across the yard. The barn was on the left as they came up the path. Maren had cracked open the doors that morning to air it out. The wet wool smell of the pack animals was the strongest smell on the property, and she liked to give it a fair chance to clear before she put visitors past it. And as they came level with the barn, the smell hit Nate in a small, steady wave that he did not react to, which Maren registered. People who had never been near pack llamas before reacted. He had been near pack llamas before. Wendell came out of the barn. Wendell was 11 years old, 240 pounds, the color of a wet brick, and the most aggressive wether on the West Coast. Astrid had bought him as a yearling because his previous owner had despaired of him. Astrid had successfully gentled him on her own property for 9 years by maintaining a single-handed feeding schedule, never letting anyone else into his pen unless she was personally present, and never, ever introducing him to a stranger without a halter on the stranger first. Wendell had bitten every person on the cannery payroll at least once. He had bitten Maren 4 times. He had bitten Aunt Tove. He had once bitten the visiting livestock veterinarian on the watch hand, which had been awkward. Wendell stopped in the middle of the yard. He looked at the 3 perfectly biteable humans on the path, Maren, Nate, and a teenager from town on his bicycle who happened to be passing by on the public road and had stopped to watch. And he walked past Maren, past the teenager, and stood directly in front of Nate. His nose was 8 inches from Nate's coat button. Nate did not move. Wendell stepped forward, lowered his head, and pressed his forehead against Nate's chest. The teenager from town said very softly, "What?" Maren did not say anything. She had been holding her basket of kindling. She kept holding her basket of kindling. Wendell kept his forehead against Nate's chest for a count of 6. Then he turned around without biting anyone, walked back to the barn, and went inside. Nate looked at Maren. "That's Wendell," she said. "All right." "He bites people." "Yes, he didn't." "I know." "Should we continue?" "Yes." They continued. She did not, on the rest of the walk to the cottage, think about the contract. She thought about Wendell. She thought about Astrid having told her the spring Wendell had been 6 and Maren had been 17, that Wendell would never let a man near him without a fight, and that this was not because Wendell hated men, but because Wendell had developed his preferences, as certain animals do, on the basis of one early bad encounter. The encounter had been with a stranger on the property. The stranger had startled him. Wendell had been a yearling. Wendell had remembered. Wendell had just not remembered. She set the basket of kindling down at the side of the cottage door, took the key from the hook, and opened the cottage. The cottage was 1 room and a bath. The bed was on the wall opposite the door. The hot plate was on the counter to the right. A kettle sat on the hot plate. The kettle was not on. The hot plate was not on. Maren had been on the bluff splitting kindling for the last 90 minutes and had not been in the cottage all day. The kettle was steaming. Nate looked at the kettle. He looked at Maren. She looked at the kettle. "Did you?" she said. "No." "All right." He set the suitcase down on the floor at the foot of the bed. He set it down, again, on its side, not its bottom. He did not unpack. He did not take his coat off. He stood in the middle of the cottage with his hands at his sides, taking in the 4 walls, the kettle, the small table under the window, and what Maren had not noticed when she came in, which was the kitchen drawer, the single drawer under the counter 2 feet to the left of the hot plate, which was open. Maren had not opened the drawer. She had not been in the cottage all day. She walked over and looked into the drawer. The drawer contained 1 teaspoon she had never seen before. The teaspoon was old, silver, not heavily polished, and engraved on the bowl with the letter A. It was, on a closer look, very clearly the matching mate of the teaspoon Astrid had used for her tea every morning for the last 48 years, which Maren had inherited along with the rest of the kitchen contents at the cannery, and had kept on a small hook above her own stove. Astrid had owned exactly one. Now Maren was holding a second one. She was not holding it. It was sitting in a drawer. She closed the drawer. She turned around. Nate was watching her. He was not surprised. He was not unsurprised. He was simply observing the cottage and her and the kettle and the drawer in the order in which they had presented themselves to him. "The cottage," she said, "does things sometimes. All right. I'm not going to explain it on your first afternoon." "Understood." "There are sheets in the chest at the foot of the bed. The bath is through that door. The plumbing works some of the time." "Yes. All right." The kettle whistled. Neither of them had touched the hot plate. The hot plate was not, on a sideways glance, plugged in. The kettle whistled anyway, in a small, steady tone, for approximately 3 seconds, and then it stopped. Maren did not look at Nate. Nate did not look at Maren. Each of them, separately, looked at the kettle. "All right," Maren said. "Right. The cannery is up the path. There's coffee in the kitchen in the morning, 6 o'clock. We start chores at 6:30. If you need anything tonight, the office porch light stays on, and I'll be in the office until 10. I'd say make yourself at home, but I have to be careful what I say in this cottage." "Understood." "Welcome to Halloran's Tide." He thought about that. She had time to notice him think about it. "Thank you," he said. "I'll do my best." She closed the cottage door behind her, and she had walked the 11 steps down the path back toward the office, and was about to put her hand on the doorknob when she heard the family pickup come up the road. The pickup was a '92 Chevy that had been Astrid's, then Aunt Tova's, then Bearder's, then, unofficially, Sigrid's. It was painted 3 different shades of off-red. It was loud. Birger and Sigrid had been in town when the 4 o'clock had docked. Bryony had been at the kiosk. Bryony had seen Nate get off the boat. Bryony had told Sigrid, who had told Birger, who had insisted on driving home. Maren had 2 minutes before they came up the drive. She used those 2 minutes to count to 10, 3 separate times. Birger and Sigrid got out of the pickup. "He's here?" Birger said. "Yes." "Where?" "In the cottage." "You put a strange man in Grandma's cottage." "Yes, Birger. By himself." "He is the contracting party named in a binding instrument that Grandma signed in 1924, Birger. And Anders has already explained to me that he has nowhere else legally allowed to live. He is in the cottage. I have just said hello. We are starting chores at 6:30 tomorrow. He met Wendell. Wendell did not bite him." "Wendell did not bite him." "No." "Wendell didn't..." "No." Sigrid said, "I'm going to look at him." Sigrid. "I'm going to look at him through the window." Sigrid, "I will personally..." Sigrid did not bother to finish the conversation. She shrugged off her jacket and her boots and her jeans in approximately 6 seconds, in approximately the order a llama-shifter does when she has decided to stop being a person. And she shifted in the middle of the gravel drive and stood there, in her llama form, for half a second, looking at Maren with an expression of weaponized sweetness. Then she turned and trotted up the path to the cottage. "Birger," Maren said. "I'm going to make sure she doesn't break a window," Birger said. He shrugged off his jacket. He sat down on the running board of the pickup to take his boots off, which was the courtesy he had to himself, because last year he had ripped a perfectly good pair of boots shifting on a beach and was now careful about footwear. "Birger." "Maren, she is my sister, and I have to mind her. You know this." "Birger." I'll meet him properly tomorrow. Berger shifted. Birger and Sigrid trotted up the path side by side. Sigrid stopped at the cottage window. Birger stopped in the middle of the path. From the cottage door, a man in a brown coat stepped out and looked at the llamas. Maren could not see his face from where she was standing. She could see his hands. His hands were at his sides. He did not move toward the llamas. He did not raise his voice. He did not, as far as Maren could tell, do anything at all. After a few seconds, he closed the cottage door, sat down on the small bench Astrid had installed on the porch for guests, and waited. Maren walked up the path past her cousins, who did not, of course, get out of her way, because they had decided to be llamas, and llamas had to commit to llama logic. She stepped over Birger. She walked past Sigrid. She arrived at the bench. She sat down on the bench beside Nate. "Two of your cousins are llamas," he said. "Yes." "I take it." "Yes." "I will not ask." "Thank you." They sat there for a while. The bluff smelled of wet wool from the barn, and salt from the bay, and the very faint smell of someone burning brush 3 coves north. Down on the dock, the 4 o'clock ferry was already gone, and the 5 o'clock had not yet arrived. The sky was the gray of a tea Maren had drunk that morning and not enjoyed. After a long minute, Nate said, "Will they come out?" "Eventually. Sigrid will not come out tonight. Birger might. He likes the truck better than the llama form because the truck has a radio." "All right. Are you hungry?" "I am, yes." "There's stew in the office. Aunt Tove will be down later. We can eat in the kitchen, or you can take a bowl back here. Whichever is easier." "I'll bring you a bowl. You stay here. I do not want you in the office tonight with my cousins as llamas." "Understood." She stood up. She turned to walk down the path, and she had her hand almost to the latch of the gate when Nate said, very quietly, behind her, "Maren." She turned back. He was still on the bench. His hands were still at his sides. He had not, she now realized, taken his coat off the entire time he had been on her property, and there was something about that fact she would think about later, but could not think about now. "I will do my best," he said. "I know," she said. She walked down the path. When she got to the office and stepped inside and put the kettle on her own hot plate, the one that was plugged in, she looked over toward the cottage on the bluff. Through the window, she could see the small lamp that had not been on all afternoon. The lamp was on. She had not turned it on. She did not need to ask whether Nate had turned it on. The cottage had turned it on. The drawer in the office kitchen behind her opened and closed by itself. Maren did not turn around. The drawer waited a respectful 3 seconds and then opened again. When she finally turned to look, the drawer contained the silver teaspoon from the cottage. She picked it up. The letter A on the bowl was, on second look, less like an engraving and more like a thing that had grown there. The teaspoon was warm. She put it in her pocket and went to get him stew. Chapter 3. Wendell, among others. By 6:15, Nate was already on the porch of the office with a cup of coffee Maren had not made him, and the kitchen drawer had opened twice. She had decided, lying in bed at 5:45, that she was going to treat this like a guest staying indefinitely and run a normal day around him. She had been running a normal day around her cousins for 30 years. She could run a normal day around a chaos demon for a week. The coffee was in a mug Astrid had made. The mug had a slight wobble in its base because Astrid had thrown her pottery on her own wheel for 61 years and had never produced a perfectly level mug in her life. Astrid had said, more than once, that a mug that did not wobble was a mug that did not know how to keep you company. "Where did you get the coffee?" Maren said. "There was a kettle on the hot plate this morning," Nate said. There was also coffee. Did you make the coffee? I did not make the coffee. All right. The kettle was hot. All right. I want to be clear that I have not been into your office. I have only been into my cottage. The coffee and the kettle were already there. I would not have presumed. I believe you. He looked at her for a half-second longer than the conversation required. She was aware, in a way she would not be able to articulate later, that this was not because he was nervous about the coffee. It was because she had said, "I believe you," without making him work for it. She pointed at the barn. Chores. He stood. He set the mug down on the porch railing. He did not finish the coffee. The barn had 2 pack llama pens, a hayloft above, and a tack room at the back where Astrid had stored 60 years of trekking equipment in a system Maren could read and no one else could. The wet wool smell was thick at 6:30 because the animals had been closed in overnight and the bay fog had come up through the boards. Maren slid the doors open. Nate stepped back to give the fog room. 12 animals, she said. 8 working pack, 3 semi-retired, 1 wether. The wether is Wendell, you've met. The pack animals all have names. I will introduce you over the week. Today, we are mucking out. Then we are weighing the working pack so I can balance the loads for the trek next week. Then we are checking hooves. The hoof check takes the longest. I'd like you to start with the muck. All right. There are pitchforks on the wall there. The boots in the corner are mine. There are spares in the 3rd stall on the hook that should fit. Take the wheelbarrow out the back. The compost heap is 50 feet down the trail. He did the work. Maren watched him do the work without watching him do the work, because she had been hauling muck since she was 9 and could do it while reading mail. He was not bad at it. He was, in fact, quietly competent at it, in a manner Maren had been hoping for and had not expected. He used the pitchfork as Astrid had, wrist instead of shoulder, which was a technique a person did not learn from a YouTube video. He hauled the wheelbarrow without tipping it. He did not leave straw in the doorway. He cleaned his fork before he set it down. She caught him stop himself twice. The first time was at the door of the 3rd stall. He had walked past, then stopped, then turned around, then walked into the stall with his fork. Maren glanced in. The stall held 2 yearling animals, and one of them, a young female named Hilda, who had been jumpy her whole life and who Astrid had still been working with at the time of her death, was standing with her back leg cocked at an angle that meant she had pulled something. Nate looked at the leg. He raised his hand, then lowered it. He raised it again and stopped again. He turned around and walked out of the stall and said, "Hilda's left hind is sore. She wants you." Maren went in. Hilda let her run a hand down the back leg. There was a small heat at the hock that had not been there yesterday. "How did you know which one was Hilda?" Maren said. "You said Hilda was jumpy. She was the one farthest from me." "How did you know she was sore?" "I am not going to answer that on day 1. All right. The second time was at the water trough. The trough had a slow leak Astrid had been meaning to fix for 2 years and had not, which was a fact about Astrid that had eventually become a fact about the trough. The water was low. Nate walked past the trough, stopped, looked at the trough, looked at the hose, looked at the spigot, walked over to the spigot, turned it on, watched the water fill the trough to a level it had not reached in 8 months, turned the spigot off, looked at Maren, opened his mouth to say something, closed his mouth, walked out of the barn and came back 2 minutes later with a small piece of dowel in his hand. "Where did you find that?" Maren said. "On the porch of the cottage." "That was not on the porch of the cottage. Yesterday it was not." "All right." He fitted the dowel into the leak in the trough. The dowel fit. The leak stopped. He looked at her. He did not say anything. That trough has been leaking for 2 years, she said. I am not going to fix anything else without asking you first. I want to be clear about that. I asked the cottage for a piece of dowel and the cottage produced one, and I used it because the water was already low. I will not do that again. All right. I am sorry. That's the second time you've stopped yourself. I noticed. He thought about whether to answer. He decided to. It is the work I came here to do, he said. Among other things. She let that sit. Wendell came out of the barn around 10 and walked beside Nate for 2 hours. Maren had been weighing the working pack on the floor scale Astrid had bought at an estate auction in 1989 and had recalibrated every year since. The weighing took place in the open yard because the scale was too heavy to keep moving and the animals preferred the wind. Maren weighed Otto first because Otto was steady, then Magnus, then the 2 Knew This Spring pack animals, and the whole time Wendell walked alongside Nate at exactly the distance a working sheepdog walks alongside a shepherd. Wendell did not look at Nate. He did not press against him. He simply walked, 2 paces behind, 1 to the left. When Nate stood still, Wendell stood still. When Nate moved, Wendell moved. When Nate stepped over a hose, Wendell stepped over a hose. By the 3rd animal, Birger, who was a llama up on the bluff watching, had also figured out what was happening and had developed a position on it. He came down off the bluff and stood 20 feet from Nate at the edge of the yard, glaring. Birger could glare effectively in his llama form because his eyes were set wide, which Maren had noted as an advantage when he was a child and was an advantage now. Your cousin is staring at me, Nate said. That's Birger. He is still a llama. He is going to stay a llama until he has decided that you are or are not a threat. I will tell him you are not. He will not believe me. All right. He will believe Aunt Tove when she gets here. All right. In the meantime, he is going to stare at you. All right. Sigrid had stayed a llama all night and was now in the office, having let herself in through the cat door Astrid had installed in 1992 and which the cousins still used despite being, in their human form, much larger than a cat. Sigrid had eaten Maren's lunch off the windowsill at 11:30. Maren had watched her do it through the kitchen window and had not interfered. Maren's lunch had been a peanut butter sandwich and a pear, and Sigrid did not like peanut butter or pears, but Sigrid had eaten both, slowly and with pleasure, in front of Maren's face. This was, Maren had long ago accepted, the price of having Sigrid as a cousin. She was scraping the scale at 20-1 when she heard Aunt Tovy's truck come up the road. Aunt Tove, she said, stay where you are. I'll go meet her. Should I? Stay where you are. Wendell will keep you company. Birger will keep glaring at you. Sigrid is in my office. The animals are weighed. The trough is fixed. The drawer in the cottage has opened by itself approximately 4 times since dawn. We are doing fine. Are we? We are doing fine, Mr. Cantwell. Nate. We are doing fine, Nate. She walked down to Aunt Tove's truck. Tove parked under the elm and did not get out for a few seconds, which was, on Tove, the equivalent of a long conversation. When she did get out, she had a stew pot in both hands and a face that meant she had been thinking about this drive the entire way down from her cove. Tell me he's here, she said. He's here. Tell me Wendell didn't bite him. Wendell did not bite him. Maren. Wendell pressed his forehead against his coat. Tova looked at her. Tova had been Astrid's only daughter and had inherited Astrid's face, although she had not been left the cannery, which had been an agreement the 2 of them had made when Aunt Tova was 43, and which Maren had not understood until she was 30 herself. Tova was 62. She had retired from competitive sport trekking the year Astrid's hip had stopped cooperating. She was as much an adult as Maren was, and Maren had been, for 9 months, very glad of it. "Maren," Tove said, "walk with me." The stew can sit. Walk with me." Maren walked with her. They went out past the office, past the yard where Nate was scraping the scale and Wendell was guarding him and Birger was glaring, and down the bluff path to the place Astrid had once called the looking spot, which was a flat stone 3 feet from the cliff edge where Astrid had stood every morning of her adult life with a cup of coffee. Maren had not stood there since Astrid had died. Tove sat down on the stone. Maren stood. "He's here," Tove said. "Anders read me the contract. Anders is a good man, and he is also an attorney, which means he reads things and does not explain things. I am going to explain a thing. Sit down." Maren sat. "Your grandmother had an older brother," Tove said. Maren had been pulling a thread on her sleeve. She stopped. "His name was Lars. Astrid never told me about a brother. Astrid never told anyone. She told me once in 1962, after she put a codicil on the contract that you have now read. She told me because she wanted one person to know in case she died before he came. That person was me. I have been one person who knew for 64 years. I would prefer not to be one person who knows anymore." Maren did not say anything. She had grown up on this bluff. She had heard Astrid talk about her parents, about her aunts, about the Pearson sisters at the post office, and the Halvorsen-Iwanaga wedding in 1944, and the year of the bad oysters, and the year of the good oysters, and the year the ferry had not run in February. She had never heard the name Lars. "Lars was 22, Tove said. Astrid was 18. The fall of 1924, a man named Hardacre, Quentin Hardacre's grandfather, wanted the Halvorsens off the family land, wanted us out of the cove. He had told the boys in the bay he would do it himself if he had to. Astrid believed him. She made a bargain. She did. With Mr. Cantwell. She did. The bargain was that he would frighten the Hardacres into leaving the family alone. The bargain did not say frighten and do no other damage, because she was 18 and she had never made a bargain before and she did not know to. He did what she asked. What he also did was not what she asked. Lars died. Lars died. Not by Mr. Cantwell's hand in the strictest sense of that word, by a thing he set in motion. Astrid lived with that for 100 years. She made him live with it for the rest of his. Maren had her hands wrapped around her own knees. The bay was quiet below them. The bluff smelled of grass and of salt and of nothing else. That's the action. That's the action. The understanding. He has to understand what he did. He has, in your grandmother's judgment, never understood. Your grandmother held him to that for 101.5 years. Now she is gone. The judgment is yours. Aunt Tove. Yeah? He doesn't seem like a man who doesn't understand. Your grandmother thought that too. Your grandmother also held the contract anyway. We are women in a long family of women, Maren. We hold the contracts we have to hold. Maren did not say anything for a while. All right, she finally said. Son. They walked back up the bluff. Wendell, when they came into the yard, was still beside Nate. Birger was still glaring at 20 feet. Nate had moved on from the scale and was now, with 2 empty buckets, walking out to the water trough, the fixed trough, to top it off, because at noon in May, the working pack drank more than at any other time of the day. He had figured this out in his first morning. He had not asked. He saw Aunt Tove. He set the buckets down. He took a single step back from them. He did not approach. Aunt Tove crossed the yard. You're Mr. Cantwell. Ignatius Cantwell. Most people call me Nate. I am Tove Halvorsen. I was Astrid's daughter. I have known about you for 64 years. I am sorry I did not know about you. Tova looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded, once, in a manner Maren recognized from her childhood as the nod Tova had given the boys at the dock the year Birger had broken a window, which meant, "We will speak again later, and you will not enjoy it, but I have noted that you are a person. You'll come for stew." "Yes." "Good." She turned and walked into the office where Sigrid was still a llama, and where the kitchen, on Maren's later inspection, would prove to be cleaner than Maren had left it. Aunt Tova had brought stew. The stew had also somehow been transferred to a serving bowl and set on the table. Sigrid the llama was, when Maren walked in, asleep on the floor under the table with her head on Tova's foot. Maren took her coat off. She had been carrying the silver teaspoon in her pocket all morning. She set it on the counter beside her own teaspoon. The 2 teaspoons were a matched pair. The letter A on Maren's teaspoon, which she had inherited from Astrid, had been engraved by a craftsman in Tacoma in 1908. The letter A on the new teaspoon was not engraved, which she had decided yesterday and was now sure of. It had grown. She looked at the kitchen drawer in the office. The drawer was closed. She opened it. The drawer contained a single small button. The button was brown wool. The button was approximately 100 years old. The button was, on closer inspection, a button that had once been sewn onto a coat. Astrid had pressed many things under glass over the course of her life. Pressed flowers, ferry tickets, a thumbprint of Maren's at 18 months. But she had never, as far as Maren had ever seen, pressed a button. Maren closed the drawer. She picked up the bowl of stew. She walked out to the porch. Nate had come back from the trough. He was sitting on the bench Aunt Tove had told him to sit on, with Wendell at his feet. He was missing, she noticed, exactly 1 button from his brown coat. The button was the second from the top. She handed him the stew. Chapter 4. The first trek. Booking. The trek was a Portland family of 4, 5 days on the coastal loop, and Maren had not yet decided whether Nate was going. She had been pretending she had decided. She had also been pretending she had not been pretending. The booking calendar was open on the kitchen table at 8 in the morning with the names: Park Family, Portland, 2 adults, 2 minors, vegetarian, no known allergies, 2 prior treks, in Astrid's handwriting, because Astrid had taken the deposit last summer. Nate was standing at the counter holding a coffee cup by its rim. He had taken the cup down from her hook, poured himself coffee, put the kettle back on the hot plate, and stepped back to drink it, all without breaking the rule he had given himself yesterday about not fixing things she had not asked him to fix. He was not, technically, doing anything wrong. He had been invited to take coffee. He was taking coffee. But he was holding the cup by its rim, with his thumb on one side of the brim and his first 2 fingers on the other, as Maren had once seen people hold a teacup at a tea ceremony in a documentary Bryony had made her watch one rainy February. He had also held it by the rim yesterday. She filed it away. She had been filing his small habits away for 2 days. The brown coat hanging on the hook, the boots set on their sides, his trick of lowering himself onto a bench instead of dropping, how he picked up a pitchfork, how he held a paper. The fact that he had not yet put his coffee cup down on a flat surface where she could see it. Park family, she said. Yes. 2 parents, 2 children, ages 7 and 11. They've been on a Halvorsen trek twice before. They like cocoa at the camp dinners. They do not like songs. They will ask about Wendell because Astrid wrote them last summer and mentioned him. The younger child wants to know if Wendell bites people. He does. He didn't bite me. Yes, well, He bites people who are not you. The younger child is named Henry. The older is named Myra. 5 days. 5 days. We leave Tuesday from the trailhead at the south end of the cove, and we come back Saturday afternoon. The route is on the wall there. The southern leg crosses Hardacre land on a grazing easement. We have run the easement since 1934. Quentin Hardacre does not love us. Quentin Hardacre's lawyer has not yet found a way to make us stop. I see. I have not decided whether you are coming on this trek. He did not answer that. He took a sip of coffee. He did not put the cup down. I'm going to drive down to the kiosk, she said. Bryony will have an opinion. I would like to have her opinion before I decide. Aunt Tove also has an opinion. Aunt Tove does not need to be asked. Her opinion is yes, take him. All right. Aunt Tovy's opinion is correct most of the time. All right. I want my own opinion too. He nodded once. He drank the last of the coffee. He set the cup down, finally, by lowering it onto the saucer she had set out for it. He had been holding the cup by its rim for almost 10 minutes. He did not, even now, touch the handle. Will you be back for the noon chores? He said. Yes. I'll be in the barn. All right. She drove down the bluff road to the dock. The road ran 1.5 miles through wet salt grass and 3 switchbacks past Mrs. Lindquist's general store, and 1 driveway shared by 2 oyster brokers, and then it came out at the harbor, where the ferry made its rotation every 2 hours, and Bryony Iwanaga ran a coffee kiosk Bryony's grandmother had built out of a renovated bait shed in 1979. The kiosk sold 4 drinks. It was closed by 2 in the afternoon. It was the only place in Halloran's Tide a person could buy a flat white. It also sold a Reuben sandwich on Wednesdays. Bryony's brother, who ran the ferry, brought the meat in on the 8 o'clock from Anacortes. Maren parked at the dock. The wet boards of the dock smelled of salt and gull and engine. The 10 o'clock ferry was coming in. The ferry whistle went once, long, when it cleared the breakwater. Bryony was already leaning out of the kiosk window. Halvorsen, Bryony said. Tell me everything. I came for a flat white. You came for an opinion. The flat white is free for opinion purchases. Bryony. His name is Ignatius. He is presenting as a brown coat. He got off the 4 o'clock yesterday with 1 suitcase he held by the sides. Mrs. Lindquist saw him pass her store at 4:33. Quentin Hardacre's office is going to start asking questions by Friday, and Mrs. Lindquist does not gossip, but Mrs. Lindquist does owe me a coffee. What does he do? He has a 100-year-old contract with my grandmother. Anders had it on his desk. He is here to live in the cottage until my grandmother's contract is satisfied. Maren. Bryony, I'm not lying to you. I am also not explaining everything to you. What I am hearing is that he is a paranormal person. Maren did not say anything. I'm going to need you to confirm or deny. He is a paranormal person. What kind of paranormal person? He is not a paranormal person I am going to discuss at the dock. That is fair. Will you discuss it at my house? Yes. All right, flat white. Bryony made the flat white. She made it correctly, with the foam at the right thickness, and a paper cup Bryony had been refilling from the same bag of beans every 2 months for the last 6 years. She handed it through the window. Maren paid because Bryony's free for opinion purchases was a long-running and unenforced principle. The Park family, Maren said. Tuesday through Saturday. I've already got the kids' sandwich pre-orders. Mira wants the chicken, Henry wants the turkey, parents want the avocado and the Reuben in that order, Coco at the end. He's offering to come with me on the trek. You haven't asked him to come on the trek. No. But he has offered. He has not technically offered. He has been there for the last 48 hours, and he has indicated to you in some manner that he will come on the trek if asked. Yes. And you have not decided? No. Bryony leaned out of the window further. The harbor wind blew her hair into her own coffee. She did not seem to notice. Maren, she said. Yes? You ran the spring trek last year alone, except for Birger and Sigrid. And Birger and Sigrid stayed llamas for 3 of the 4 days, and you came home with bursitis in your shoulder and a face like you had been at war with the moon. Yes? Take him. Bryony. Take him. You are not going to take him because you are going to have romantic feelings about him on a 5-day trek through fog. You are going to take him because you would have to take a stranger anyway, and at least this one is a stranger you have a 102-year-old contract with. It's not romantic, Bryony. Maren. It isn't. Maren, I have known you for 31 years, and I have never once seen you take an opinion about a man before pressing it into a small pancake of the opinion's component parts and pre-sorting them into the order you trust them in. And this morning, you have come to my kiosk to ask me what I think about a man before you have done that to your own opinions. That is a thing. That is a thing I am noting. I am not pressing further. I am noting. All right. Take him. All right. Also, he is here. Where? Standing 40 feet behind you on the dock with a llama. Maren did not turn around. She had been on the dock for 9 minutes. She had not heard a truck come in from the bluff road. She had not heard a llama. She had heard the ferry whistle. She had heard Bryony's espresso machine. She had heard a gull. She had not heard a brown coat and a wether walk 4 blocks from the cannery and stop 40 feet behind her at the end of the dock. He's been there for 2 minutes, Bryony said. He stopped halfway down the dock when he saw I was leaning out the window. He has not approached. The llama is sitting. The llama is Wendell, and I have not seen Wendell move that calmly in my life. Maren. Maren. Maren, look behind you. Maren looked. Nate was 40 feet behind her on the dock. His hands were in his coat pockets. Wendell, 12 inches from Nate's left boot, was lying down in the public passage, flat on the belly position of a working dog at a livestock show. Wendell was watching the ferry come in. There was a small commotion 8 feet to Nate's right at the dock railing, where a young couple from off-island was trying to get a child's life vest onto a 4-year-old who did not want a life vest on. The child was bracing as 4-year-olds brace, full body, all 4 limbs, head tilted backwards. The mother was trying to get the buckle. The father was trying not to drop a folding stroller. The vest had been on backwards for a count of 15 seconds, and the parents had not yet noticed. Maren watched. Nate watched. Nate did not move. It would have been a small thing. It would have been a thing any person would have done. He could have walked over with his unobtrusive coat and his unobtrusive face and turned the life vest around and stepped back, and the parents would have thanked him, and the child would have settled, and the ferry would have come and gone. He could have done it without thinking. Maren could see, from 40 feet away, that he had thought about doing it. He did not do it. After 11 seconds, the mother figured the vest out. She turned it around. The child settled. The ferry slid into the dock with its rope wet and shining. The whistle went twice, short. Nate's hands stayed in his pockets. Huh, Bryony said. Maren turned around. Bryony. What? What did you see just now? I saw a man not help a couple with a life vest. I saw a man very specifically not help. That is what I saw. That is what he saw too. Yes. Maren. Yes. Take him on the trek. Maren walked the 40 feet down the dock. Wendell did not stand up. Nate did not move toward her. She stopped in front of him. You walked 4 blocks, she said. I did. With Wendell. He came along. You did not help the parents. No. Why? He thought about whether to answer. He decided to. It was not necessary, he said. The mother had a working hand. The vest would have come right in approximately 12 seconds. I am here under terms. The terms are that I am to do no harm. I do not, at the present time, know with confidence what counts as harm and what counts as help. I am, until I know, erring on the side of not acting. I am sorry I followed you to the dock. I will go back to the barn. You can stay. I will go back to the barn. You came for an opinion. I would like you to be able to get it. I got it. All right. Nate. Yes. You're coming on the trek. He nodded once. All right, he said. She knew, when he nodded, that he had already decided to say all right at some point before she had said, you're coming on the trek. She did not know exactly when he had decided. She had a suspicion. She had a suspicion that he had decided he would say all right at the moment he had not stepped forward to help with the life vest, because in that moment, on the dock, he had run a small calculation about what the next thing she would ask him was going to be, and had run the calculation accurately. She did not say anything else. She turned around. She walked back up the dock to her truck. Wendell stood up and walked to Nate's left side and waited. She got into her truck and shut the door. Bryony at the kiosk said, Maren, drive carefully. Maren drove carefully. Driving back up the bluff road, she passed Mrs. Lindquist's general store. Mrs. Lindquist was on her porch, sweeping. The slow corner sweep she did whenever she was watching for a truck coming up the road from the dock. Mrs. Lindquist did not wave. Maren did not wave back. The waving had been settled between them in 1996, and they no longer did it. She drove on. At the cannery, she parked under the elm. She got out. She walked into the office. The kettle was on. She had not put it on. The kettle was, on closer inspection, the office kettle, not the cottage kettle, which was a distinction Maren had been forced to start making in the last 48 hours. She poured a cup. The cup was the wobble mug Astrid had thrown in 1989. She drank the coffee. What she noticed, what she would later realize she had been noticing the entire drive back from the dock, was not that Nate had walked 4 blocks with a llama. It was not that Wendell had lain down on the dock like a working dog. It was not that Bryony had pressed her on the romantic feelings she did not yet have and had filed away the possibility she might. It was that Nate had, on the dock, run the calculation accurately. She set the coffee down. She picked up the booking calendar. Under the Park family entry, in her own handwriting, she added, Second guide, I Cantwell. She closed the calendar. The drawer in the office kitchen behind her opened, paused, and closed. She did not turn around. Chapter 5. Coastal Loop, Day 2. Birger arrived at camp on the second afternoon in human form, on foot, with a grievance about Sigrid that he intended to relitigate in front of clients. The Portland kids saw him before Maren did. Maren saw the kids see him and began running calculations. The Park family had been a good booking so far. Mira, the 11-year-old, had taken to Otto on the first morning and had been walking by his shoulder for 2 days. Henry, the 7-year-old, had asked Maren 4 times whether Wendell was going to bite him, and Maren had told him 4 times the truth, which was that Wendell was on this trek because Astrid would have killed her if she had left him at home, and Wendell would not bite a person who did not first do something obviously stupid. Henry had then asked what counted as obviously stupid, and Maren had given him a list, and Henry had been honoring the list with the seriousness of a clerk handling a sealed envelope. The parents were quieter people who had been on 2 Halvorsen treks before. They had liked Astrid. They had not yet asked about Astrid, which Maren had registered and was grateful for. Nate was a second guide nobody had asked about. He had walked at the back of the line for 2 days with one of the older pack animals on a lead, had cooked a clean dinner on the first night, had introduced himself once to each member of the family by name, and then had not spoken at mealtimes unless spoken to. Mira had decided she liked him. Henry was withholding judgment. The parents had asked Maren about him on the first afternoon, and Maren had given them the only sentence she had managed to compose in 2 days, which was, "He's helping with the operation this season." The parents had accepted it. Wendell walked beside Nate. Wendell had walked beside Nate for 2 days. The camp was set in a flat clearing above a small bay on the southern leg, with the tents in a loose half circle, the pack animals tethered along a single line in the lee of the rocks, and the fire pit in the center of the half circle. Maren had been setting out the dinner equipment when she heard footsteps on the trail behind her. Quick footsteps, made by a man not bothering to be quiet, in a particular rhythm Maren had been hearing all her life, and she did not have to turn to know it was Bearder. Beardger came around the bend with the family Subaru's spare key on a string around his neck, and a face that meant he had driven the road to the trailhead at the speed of a man who had a complaint he had been holding for 30 miles. "Maren," he said. "Berger." Sigrid took the boat keys. "Berger." Sigrid took the boat keys and she has not given them back. And she is supposed to give the boat keys to Aunt Tovey on Wednesday, and Aunt Tovey called me to find out where the boat keys were, and I told her Sigrid had them. And Aunt Tovey said I was to find Sigrid and get the keys, and Sigrid is a llama and she is in the elm and she will not come down. Maren paused. She had been kneeling beside the dinner box. She set the lid down on the dinner box and stood up. The Park family was sitting on rocks near the fire pit, mid-conversation about a hike they had taken in Olympic the year before, and they were now all 4 looking at Beardger. Mira had her hands very politely folded. Henry was holding a flat stone he had picked up on the trail and was about to ask Nate whether the flat stone was a good rock. He had stopped. "Berger," Maren said, "this is Mr. and Mrs. Park. This is Mira. This is Henry. This is my cousin Berger." "Hello," said Mrs. Park brightly. "Hi," said Beardger. He had registered the family. He had not registered the family enough. "Beardger," Maren said. "Maren, Aunt Tove." "Berger." "Aunt Tove called twice, and Sigrid will not." "Berger, I am running a trek. Mira and Henry are on this trek with their parents. Aunt Tove can tell Sigrid the boat keys can wait until Saturday. The boat is at the dock. Aunt Tove can use her own spare. Aunt Tove has known where her own spare boat key has been for 19 years. I am not relitigating the boat keys at the trek camp." Maren. "Berger." He had walked, in the course of this exchange, 4 steps closer to the dinner box. He was now within arm's reach of it. The dinner box contained, among other things, the cocoa, the dry pasta, and Nate's packstrap on the lid, because Nate had set his packstrap there 12 minutes ago when he had stopped to unstrap one of the older animals. Beardger reached for the packstrap. He did not know it was a packstrap. He was a man who reached for things on a flat surface when he was angry, because his hands needed something to hold. Nate, who had not spoken since the Park family had said hello, moved his foot. He had been standing 6 feet away with the lead in his hand. He stepped sideways once, in the unobtrusive shuffle of a person making room for a passerby, and in the same motion he leaned over and picked up the packstrap from the lid of the dinner box and clipped it onto the lead. Birger's hand closed on the lid of the dinner box because the pack strap was no longer on it. Birger did not see Nate move. Maren saw Nate move. Wendell saw Nate move. Wendell, who had been at Nate's left boot for 2 days, took a step forward and lowered his head and pressed his entire 240 pounds against Birger's right thigh. Birger lost his balance. He did not fall. He took a corrective step. He was an experienced llama-shifter and an experienced llama handler, and he knew that 240 pounds of wether against the right thigh was a meaningful piece of information about where one's body should be. He took the corrective step and stopped and looked at Wendell. "Wendell," Birger said. Wendell did not move. "Wendell, what?" Wendell did not move. Wendell was not biting. Wendell was, in his enormous calm, simply standing against Birger's thigh. Henry, who was 7 years old, said in a small, reverent voice, "Mom, Mom, the big llama is body-blocking Cousin Birger." Mr. Park said, "Henry, hush." Mira said, "It's like a working dog. It's like a working dog." Mrs. Park said, "Mira, hush. Maren. Maren, is this okay?" Maren said, "Yes." She crossed the half circle. She did not run. She did not raise her voice. She walked to Birger and put her hand on his shoulder. "Birger." "Yes." "You did not drive 30 miles to harass a family of paying clients. You drove 30 miles because Aunt Tove asked you to. And now you have driven 30 miles and you are tired and you need to sit down and eat a sandwich. There is a sandwich in the cooler in my truck at the trailhead. The trailhead is 3/4 of a mile back along the trail. I am going to walk you to the trailhead. I am going to give you the sandwich. I am going to call Aunt Tove from the satellite phone in the lockbox in the truck. Aunt Tove is going to handle Sigrid. You are going to drive home. You will see me on Saturday." "Maren, the boat." "Birger." He looked at her. Then he looked at Wendell. Wendell was still pressed against his thigh. "Komma," Maren said. The word was Astrid's. Astrid had used it 5 times in her life that Maren had personally witnessed, and twice that Birger had personally witnessed. It was the Norwegian for come, used as an order, in a tone that admitted of no other answer. Astrid had not used it on her grandchildren often because she had not had to. Birger nodded. "All right," he said. "All right." Wendell stepped back. Maren took her hand off Birger's shoulder. She walked with Birger out of the half circle and onto the trail. Wendell did not follow. Wendell returned to Nate's left boot. Maren walked Birger the 3/4 of a mile to the trailhead in silence. At the truck, she handed him the turkey sandwich from the cooler and the thermos of coffee, dug the satellite phone out of the lockbox, and called Aunt Tove, who, with the calm, grim authority of a woman who had been Astrid's daughter and Birger's aunt for 43 years, explained the boat key situation to him directly on the line. Birger hung up. He drove off. Maren walked back to camp. The Park family was eating pasta. Mira was telling Henry in great detail the difference between a working dog and a herding dog on the basis of approximately one Animal Planet special. Henry was nodding. Nate was at the fire, stirring the pasta. Wendell was lying down beside him. The pack animals were on their line in the rocks, bell clinks from their halter chains audible in the wind. Maren sat down beside Nate. He handed her a bowl of pasta. "The pack strap," she said. "Yes." "You moved it." "Yes." "He did not see you move it." "No." "He would have grabbed it." "He would have." "That was a chaos move." "It was." "You did not, as far as I can tell, do any chaos." "No. I did one chaos-shaped move at the speed required to keep it from being chaos-shaped. I am sorry. Don't be sorry. All right. Why? He thought about that. Because the family was sitting 12 feet away, he said. Because Mira had her hands folded. Because Henry was holding the flat stone. Because I have been on this property for 1 week, and the chaos I have done in that week is a fixed leak in a trough and a clean dinner. Because if Birger had picked up the pack strap, the next thing he would have done was throw it, and the family would have asked Mrs. Park later in the car why the second guide had not stopped it, and Mrs. Park would have told them she did not know, and the trek would have ended with the family writing a careful, unfavorable review. You're worried about the review. I am worried about the operation. All right. And I did not move because Birger was a threat. I moved because the pack strap was on the dinner box. The pack strap was not where it should be. I moved the pack strap. The fact that the move had a secondary effect was, in the strictest legal interpretation of the contract, a coincidence I have noted, but did not plan. That is the most lawyered explanation I have ever heard. I have known a great many lawyers. Anders Petrescu, for one. He is not the first Petrescu I have known. There was a Petrescu in Tacoma in 1937 who had the same nose. Maren did not answer that for a moment. Eat your pasta, she said. Yes. They ate. The pack animals shifted at their line. The bells on the halter chains made small sounds against the rock. The fire had been laid by Nate at the start of dinner and had settled into the deep orange of a fire that has eaten its kindling and is breathing on its sticks. Mira lay back on her sleeping pad with her hands behind her head and informed Henry, with the great certainty of an 11-year-old, that the moon was going to be full in 3 days, although it was not. Henry believed her. Mr. and Mrs. Park exchanged a look across the fire that Maren had seen Astrid exchange across a fire with another parent 30 years before. By 8:30, the family was zipped into their tent. By 9, the camp was quiet, except for the fire which popped twice and settled. Maren and Nate were on a fallen cedar log on the far side of the half-circle. Wendell was lying down on the other side of the log. The pack animals were quiet on their line. The bay below the camp had gone dark, and the smell of salt on the damp wool of the pack blankets came up in a slow, even pulse. Maren had a thermos of cocoa in her hands. She had not opened it. The metal was warm. She did not look at him when she said it. What did you do in 1924? He took a long breath. He let it out. I do not remember the action clearly, he said. I remember the after. She waited. I remember walking on a road I had not walked on the day before. I remember a coat I had been wearing 2 months. I remember a name I had been using 6 weeks. I remember that the air in October smelled of salt and rain and apple sugar from the press at the south end of the town. I remember that I had been asked to do a thing. I remember that I did it. I do not remember which thing I did. I remember the after. I have been remembering the after for 100 years. What was the after? There was a young woman in a kitchen who had asked me to do the thing. She came to the door of the kitchen after the thing was done. She had a cup of tea in her hand. She did not give me the tea. She said, I am going to write a paper. I said, all right. She wrote a paper. I signed the paper. I have not been able to remember the action since I signed the paper. That is the after. The paper is the after. The paper Anders has. Yes. My grandmother. Yes. Lars. I will not be able to talk about Lars on a trek with the Park family asleep 12 feet away. All right. She did not push. She had not been planning to push. He had told her more than she had asked. The thermos in her hands was still warm. She opened it, finally, and poured cocoa into the metal lid and handed the lid to him. He looked at her for slightly too long. He had not looked at her like this before. She had not been looked at like this in a long time. He took the lid of the thermos with his fingers on the rim, not the body, and he drank from it. The fire popped once. Neither of them said anything for a long time. The pack animals shifted. The bells did not exactly chime. They did not exactly clink either. The cedar log under them was cold on the underside and warm on the top because they had been sitting on it for an hour. The bay smelled of salt and damp wool, and far off, the smell of apple sugar that Nate had described, although that was, Maren thought, 100 years too late for that smell to still be in the air, and was probably something she was inventing because he had described it. She did not mind inventing it. Wendell shifted on the other side of the log. He did not stand up. He turned his head, looked at Nate, exhaled once, and put his head back down. Maren did not say we should sleep because she did not want to ruin the cocoa. She did not say thank you for telling me because Astrid had taught her never to say that sentence. She did not say what was her name because Nate had not named Astrid in the telling, and she did not want to make him name her tonight. She said, "There is one more cup in the thermos." He said, "All right." She poured it. He drank it. The fire kept eating its sticks. The pack animals kept being calm at their line. By 9:45, when she finally stood up and walked to her own tent, the camp had gone quiet in a particular trail camp register Maren had known since she was 12, which meant the trek was going to be all right. Behind her, Nate stayed on the log beside Wendell. The lid of the thermos was empty in his hand. He was holding it by its rim. Chapter 6. Halfway Home. Halfway home. There was a moss patch on the side of the trail in the shape Astrid had drawn at the kitchen table for 30 winters. Maren walked ahead of the group to compose herself. She felt the shift coming and could not stop it. Day 3 had been a quiet day. The weather had held. Mira had found 4 flat stones, 2 of which she had presented to Nate at dinner, and 1 of which she had given to Otto. Henry had asked Maren, on the trail, what wethers were for, and Maren had given him an honest answer, which had taken 12 minutes and had ended with Henry deciding wethers were the most underrated animals in the catalog. They had camped at a wind-protected spot above a different beach. Nobody had shifted on or off trail. Birger had been on the bluff in his llama form and had not approached. The trek had run on day 3 as Halvorsen treks were supposed to run. Day 4 of the trek had been going well too. The Park family was fine. The pack animals were fine. The weather was holding. Mira and Henry had spent the morning collecting more flat stones in the careful, sorted by pocket discipline of children who had been correctly trained by their mother. Mr. and Mrs. Park had asked, finally, about Astrid, and Maren had been able to answer them without going to pieces, which she had been quietly proud of and had not let on. The Hardacre easement section had passed without incident. The trail descended the last leg toward the cove. They would be home by mid-afternoon. Birger had chaos shifted on trail at 6 in the morning. He had done it on the bluff above their tents, in his llama form, and then refused to shift back. Maren had not been told. She had found out at 8 from a text Sigrid had sent at 8:06 from town, which read, "Birger is a llama on the bluff. Magnussons are upset. Also, I am a llama in the office and will not be cleaning today." The text had a photo attached. The photo showed Sigrid the llama on the office hot plate, where she had no business being, eating something Maren could not identify. Maren had read the text on the sat phone at the breakfast circle. She had answered with one word: acknowledged. She had not panicked. She had spent the morning hours running calculations. The Magnusons lived on the far side of the bluff and had owned the bluff for 60 years and had a standing agreement with Astrid that Halvorsen llamas could be on the bluff at any hour as long as they did not eat the dahlias. The dahlias were already gone for the season. There was nothing for Birger to ruin on the bluff today. The office was a different matter. Sigrid as a llama on the hot plate was a Sigrid as a llama on the hot plate problem. Maren had been having problems like it all her life. She had been having more of them since Astrid died. She had been the only person solving them for 9 months, and now there was no person not her solving them, and the cannery was empty, and Aunt Tove was at a friend's house in Anacortes for the day, and the office hot plate had a specific cord that was bad in cold weather, and Sigrid weighed 200 pounds, and Maren had 3 hours of trail left. It was a Birger as a llama on the bluff problem. It was a Sigrid as a llama on the hot plate problem. It was a Maren running a business alone problem. She had run the calculations all morning. She had run them well. She had not let her face do anything during the calculations. Because Mira was 11 and was a child who watched faces, and Mrs. Park had been watching Maren since the first morning of the trek, with the careful concern of a mother who had buried her own mother 3 years earlier. She had run the calculations well until the moss patch. The moss patch was on the inland side of the trail, at the place the trail bent right around an old cedar stump. The moss had grown over the south face of the stump in a precise oval shape, with a smaller circle at the top and a long tail at the bottom. The pattern was the pattern Astrid had drawn on the back of envelopes for 30 winters, in pencil, when Astrid was thinking. Maren had not known why Astrid drew it. Maren had not asked. Astrid had drawn it as some people tap a foot, a habit, not a sentence, and you did not ask people about their habits. Maren saw the moss. She felt the shift come up under her sternum. She had not felt the shift come up since 2015. The shift had been her secret since she was 22, when she had spent 6 months working it out alone in the bluff bunkhouse, with Astrid not asking her any questions, and at the end of those 6 months, she had decided she was not going to let it happen anywhere anyone could see. She had kept that promise to herself for 11 years. She had kept it through her wedding to Pete, annulled, through her divorce from Pete, formalized, through her grandmother's funeral. She had not shifted once. She held it. She held it as Astrid had taught her to hold any animal panic, by acknowledging it, naming it, walking it through. She held it for 4 seconds. She lost it on the 5th. She had time, before it took her, to do 2 things. She turned. She said in a level voice over her shoulder to the Park family, who were 80 feet behind her on the trail, "Take a 5-minute water break. I'm going off trail for a minute. Nate, on me." She walked, fast, off the trail and behind the cedar stump and into the small clearing the moss patch had been pointing at, as something in a dream points at the next thing. And she had her coat off by the time she reached the clearing, her boots by the time she reached the moss, her jeans and her shirt and her sock by a beat before the shift took her. 250 pounds of llama in a clearing. Her clothes in a pile. Her coat draped on a log because she had thrown it there as she ran, and the coat was the wet wool of an old Halvorsen pack coat that had absorbed 2 days of trail and was, even in pile form, distinctly hers. She stood in the clearing. She was a llama. She had not been a llama in 11 years. She had forgotten until this moment what it felt like to be 250 pounds. She had forgotten how her sight changed at the corners. She had forgotten that the world was lower. She had not forgotten the smell of the moss patch. The moss smelled as it had smelled when she was small, and Astrid was alive, and Astrid had said, on a winter morning in the kitchen, "If you ever need to be quiet, you can be quiet here." and Astrid had drawn the oval with the small circle and the long tail on the back of an envelope and held the envelope up to the light. Maren the llama stood in the clearing. She heard Otto, 50 yards behind her on the trail, exhale once. She heard the Park family, 80 yards behind her, talking quietly as good clients talk on a 5-minute break. She heard a man's boots on the trail. The boots were Nate's. The boots stopped at the cedar stump. The boots did not come into the clearing. There was a long silence. She heard him sit down. The log on the trail side of the stump was not a log Nate would have known about. He had not been on this trail before today. He had still found a log. He had sat down on the log. He said in his unremarkable voice, "I'll wait." She did not move. "I'll wait," he said, "until you'd like me to leave or you'd like me to help." She did not move. He did not move. The fog had been moving in low all morning. It came over the clearing now in a slow, even drift. The moss patch on the cedar stump caught the fog. The clearing smelled of moss and salt and the wet wool of her own coat on the log behind her. She was a llama. She had not been seen as a llama by anyone except Astrid and Aunt Tove since she was 22. She had not been seen as a llama by a man in her life. She was not afraid of Nate. She had thought she would be on the moment this happened, because she had been imagining the moment in some abstract form for 11 years, and had always assumed the version of the moment that contained a man would be a version of the moment she was afraid. She was not afraid. She was, instead, looking at a moss patch. She had been told, in many ways and at many ages, that she was the responsible one in the family. She had been told it by Astrid, who had meant it. She had been told it by Aunt Tove, who had meant it as a kindness. She had been told it by Bryony, who had meant it as a slight criticism. She had been told it by Pete, who had meant it as a complaint, which was one of the reasons she had stopped being married to Pete. The responsible one was a person who did the calculation and ran the trek and brought the family back. The responsible one was the person on the bluff in the dawn with the kettle. The responsible one was the only person who knew where the spare boat keys were. The responsible one was the person you did not have to ask about whether she had eaten lunch, because the responsible one had eaten lunch. The responsible one was a llama in a clearing. She stood in the clearing for 2 minutes. She heard Nate breathe. She heard a thrush, somewhere very high, calling once and not again. After 2 minutes, she walked, very slowly, to the cedar stump. She put her chin on the top of the moss patch. The moss was warm, sun-warmed, the heat not yet stripped by the fog. She left her chin there for a count of 20. The thrush did not call again. She turned. She walked to the pile of her clothes. She stood beside the pile. She felt the shift come back. She did not let it come back as it had come up the first time, in panic. She let it come back as Astrid had told her to let things come back. Slowly, body informed in advance. Her hands. The calluses on her hands. She thought of the small scar on her left thumb she had given herself at 14 on a pitchfork. The barometer drop of her own breath. She thought of her hair, which she had not braided that morning, and which would now have to be rebraided. She came back at Astrid's tempo, and the wet wool of her coat was the first thing her shoulder felt, a relief Astrid had once described in the kitchen, and which Maren had not understood until now. She dressed. She did not rush. She buttoned the coat. She put the boots on. She tied them. She wrapped the wet braid loosely with the elastic she had been carrying in the coat pocket since the start of the trek. She picked up her hat from the moss patch and put it on. She walked back to the cedar stump. Nate was on the log. He had not moved. His hands were on his thighs, not in his pockets. He was looking at the trail in the direction of the Park family. He had not, as far as Maren could tell, looked at the clearing once. She sat down on the log beside him. She did not say anything for a count of 10. He did not say anything for a count of 10. She said finally, "How long was I in there?" 6.5 minutes. The Park family is on their water break. Mira has counted 26 pebbles. Henry is up to 14. All right. Otto has not moved. All right. Wendell did not follow me. He is at the head of the pack line. All right. She looked at her hands. Her hands were her hands. The small scar on her left thumb was still there. Her coat was buttoned correctly. Her boots were on. You did not look, she said. I did not. Why? Because you had walked off trail without looking back. I have been on this property 9 days. You have not given me permission to look. I would not have looked. All right. Maren. Yes. I will not talk about this with anyone. All right. I will not talk about it with you unless you say so. All right. I am sorry I was on the log. You needed to be on the log. I was on the log because I did not want to leave you alone in the clearing. I know. I am not angry. All right. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. We have an hour and a half of trail, she said. The family is going to ask why I left the trail. I am going to say that one of the pack animals had an issue I needed to handle. They will accept it because Mira is a clever child who will know I am lying and will not press. And Mr. and Mrs. Park were on the dock on the day the older child saw me at a wedding once and saw me lie a different lie. I have a long history of lying about this. I have not yet been bad at it. All right. On the trail today, you will walk in front. I will walk at the rear. Otto will be with you. Wendell will be with you. All right. We will get back to camp. We will get the family on the trailhead bus. We will drive home. All right. And when we are home. Yes. When we are home, I am going to ask Aunt Tove to come down for dinner, and the 3 of us are going to sit at the kitchen table, and you are going to tell me what happened in 1924 in a sentence Aunt Tove can also hear. Yes. She stood up. He stood up. They walked back along the trail to where the Park family was sitting. Mira had counted 28 pebbles. Henry had given up on his count at 16 because the count had become tedious and was about to give up on flat stones entirely. Mrs. Park was looking at the trail with the careful concern of a mother who had buried her own mother 3 years earlier, and who had now decided the Halvorsen guide was a person whose privacy was not to be violated under any circumstance. All sorted, Maren said. All sorted, said Mrs. Park. Henry said, Was the animal Wendell? No, Henry. The animal was a different animal. What animal? A trail animal. A short, brown animal, not Wendell. Oh. Are we hiking again? We're hiking again. They hiked again. Nate walked at the head of the line beside Otto. Maren walked at the rear with Wendell. The fog lifted off the trail by noon. By 1, they could see the cove. By 2, they were at the trailhead. The Park family loaded their gear into the shuttle bus. Mira hugged Maren. Henry hugged Wendell, who did not bite him. Mr. and Mrs. Park shook Maren's hand and Nate's hand and got into the bus and waved until the bus turned at the bend and was gone. Maren and Nate stood at the trailhead. The pack animals waited. All right, Maren said. All right, Nate said. They drove the pack animals the 4 miles home in the gooseneck trailer. Maren drove. Nate rode in the passenger seat with his hands on his thighs. Wendell rode in the trailer in the lead position, which was a position he had never agreed to take before this trip. They pulled into the cannery at 3:40. The cottage door was open. Maren had locked the cottage door before she had left for the trailhead Tuesday morning. The cottage door was open. She got out of the truck. She walked up the path. Nate followed. The cottage was empty. The hot plate was off. The kettle was on its side on the counter, which it had never been on its side on the counter before, in a position a person setting it down would not have set it in. The drawer was closed. Maren walked to the drawer. She tried to open it. The drawer did not open. She tried again. The drawer did not open. The drawer was locked. The drawer had a lock she had never seen before, a small brass key plate on the front, where there had not been a key plate yesterday. The brass was old. The brass was 100 years old. The brass had been built into the drawer face by a craftsman who was not a craftsman Maren knew, because the wood around the brass was not new wood. The wood had grown around the brass. She did not have the key. She looked at the kettle on its side. She looked at the door, which was open. She looked at Nate, who was standing in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his coat still buttoned. "The cottage," she said. "Yes, the cottage knows." "I think so. The cottage is locking itself. I think it has." She set her hand flat on the front of the drawer. The drawer was warm. The wood was the warmth of a drawer that had been recently disturbed. She kept her hand there. The cottage did not open the drawer. She took her hand off. "I'll call Aunt Tove," she said. She walked out of the cottage. Nate stood for one more second in the doorway. He looked at the drawer. He set his suitcase down on the floor beside the bed. For the first time, on the floor flat, not on its side. And he closed the door behind him as he came out, gently, as a person closes a door that has been doing things on its own. The drawer in the cottage behind the closed door ticked once, like a clock. Chapter 7. Rereading the contract. Maren had the contract on the kitchen table by 10 the next morning. Nate had not read it since 1924. Astrid's teenage handwriting was in the margins. She had picked it up from Anders Petrescu at 9. Anders had handed it over without ceremony, in the same folder he had handed it in the first time, with a paperclip Maren had not used. She had thanked him. She had not, on the drive back up the bluff, looked at it. She had set it on the passenger seat. She had driven home. She put the kettle on. She set out 2 mugs, her own wobble mug and a second mug Astrid had thrown in 1991 with a brown glaze and a chip on the rim, and a tin of biscuits Bryony had brought to the funeral and which Maren had been keeping closed on the counter for 6 months. She opened the tin. The biscuits were stale. She arranged 6 of them on a small plate anyway. They would not be eaten. The arranging was for her. She walked to the cottage. She knocked on the door once and stood back. Nate opened the door. He had not been asleep. He had been sitting on the bench inside the door in his coat, which Maren registered and then chose not to remark on. Wendell was lying down across the threshold. "Kitchen," she said. "I have the document. I want to read it with you." "Yes." "Wendell can come." "All right." "Cousins are not invited." "All right." He stepped over Wendell. Wendell stood up and followed at his left boot. They walked back to the office. The cottage drawer behind them ticked twice. The lock on the drawer had not yet released. Maren had checked. She had also not told the cousins. Sigrid had been a llama for 16 hours. Bjerger was at the Magnussons' bluff, where the Magnussons had served him a small bowl of oats and were trying, slowly, to talk him into shifting back. Aunt Tove was coming down at 4 with stew. Anders was at his desk in town with a spare copy of the contract in his lower drawer in case Maren needed it on the phone. The cannery kitchen was empty. Maren sat down at the table. Nate sat across from her. Wendell lay down at the threshold of the kitchen door, his head on his forepaws, and pressed his forehead against the closed door from the inside. Wendell was not allowed in the kitchen on chore days. Wendell knew this. Wendell was holding to the rule by lying down at the door. The forehead against the door was, Maren understood, his way of telling her she should know he was right there. She slid the contract across the table. Nate did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it. He looked at her. He pulled a pair of glasses out of his coat pocket and put them on. The glasses were small, round, wire frame, and at least 80 years old. She had not seen them before. "You wear glasses," she said. "For reading, I have not been wearing them. I have been making do." "That is the second thing you have done this week I did not know you did." "What was the first?" "You took a coffee cup down from a hook in my office on the second morning, and you did not break the cup." "Was I going to break the cup?" "My grandmother's mugs do not last in the hands of people I am not related to. My ex-husband broke 3 of them in 11 months, and the marriage did not, in retrospect, survive." "All right." "Read the contract." He read the contract. He read it letter by letter. As he had told Maren, he read everything, although now Maren had a chance to watch him read it, and she could see he was not reading it letter by letter. He was reading it like a man going back to a piece of paper he had signed at 1 a.m, 100 years ago, and was very afraid he had signed something worse than he remembered. His face did not change. When he finished the operative text, he turned to the margin notes. He read the first one, "Do no harm because you have to do no harm," with his thumb under it. He read the second, "Do not pretend you do not know what you did," without his thumb under it. He read the third, "I will know," and lifted his thumb to it and held the thumb there a long time. Astrid had pressed the pencil on the will until the wood had broken. The break in the lead was still visible. The graphite had smudged across the year date. He took his thumb off. "I have not seen the margin notes," he said. "She did not show me when she wrote them." "She wrote them after." "She wrote the first 2 after. She wrote the third later. The other notes were on the page when I signed it." "What were the other notes?" He turned the contract over. He pointed to a small line of writing in the lower right corner, in iron gall, which was not in Astrid's handwriting, and which Maren had assumed was a piece of legal preamble. "That is mine." "What does it say?" "It says, 'I will come when called.' It is the line I added to the contract when I signed it because she asked me to. It is the line that is enforcing the residency." "You added a line." "I added 1 line. She wrote 11 clauses. She had 10 clauses ready when I came to the door of the kitchen. She added the 11th on the spot, which said that until the action was understood, I was to live where she lived. I asked her to let me make 1 addition. She let me. The addition was the line that I would come when called. I made the addition because at 1 a.m, on the night the action had been done, the woman who had asked me to do the thing was sitting in her father's kitchen with a cup of tea she had not given to me, and I did not believe she would ever again call for me without good reason. I wanted the contract to require me to come." Maren looked at the line. She looked at the rest of the page. "You signed this thinking it was kindness." "I did." "You signed it thinking she will not call me unless she has to." "Yes." "She did not call you for 101 years." "She did not." "What did you do for 101 years?" He considered. "I worked at a fish supply warehouse in Tacoma from 1978 to last month. I lived in the apartment above it. I ate a tin of sardines for breakfast every morning for 41 years because the warehouse had a standing arrangement with a Norwegian supplier who sent me a case every quarter for half price. And before Tacoma, Sacramento, a boarding house. Before that, a train. The whole time, I was doing the math. 41 years. Yes. Nate. Yes. What are you?" He considered that one longer. "I am not." He stopped. He started again. I am not what the folklore would call me, exactly. I am not human. I do not age. The folklore's word is demon because the folklore does not have a better one, and I would not have used it. I do not bargain in souls. What I have is your grandmother's word for it. Chaos. A tendency for the world near me to move slightly out of true on request. I am not, in the strict sense, immortal. I have continued because nothing has required me to stop. The contract was the nearest thing to a requirement, and the contract is satisfied tomorrow, if you ask it of me. I do not know what happens after that. I have not, in 101 years, been particularly interested in finding out. All right. Maren. Yes? I will not eat sardines in your kitchen. I know, you said. 41 years of sardines. Yes? You will not eat sardines in my kitchen. I will not. She called you by dying. Yes? Maren did not say anything. The kettle on the hot plate, which she had set the burner on under 10 minutes ago, began to whistle gently. She had not yet turned the heat up. The kettle was at a setting 2 degrees below boiling. The kettle was not screaming. It was whistling. She lifted the kettle. She poured into both mugs. She set the kettle back. The burner was not on. She turned the burner off, in case. Mr. Cantwell, she said. Nate, tell me about my grandmother. All right. He took his glasses off. He set them on the table beside the contract. He looked at the surface of the table for a moment before he spoke. The table was a Halvorsen table, 68 years old, with a small cigarette burn at one corner that Aunt Tovey had made by accident at 15 and had been forbidden to apologize for ever again. She was small, he said. She was 18. She was small for 18. She was, I think, 4'11". She had been working at the post office for 2 years because her father had a leg that did not work in winter, and she was the eldest of the daughters and the most everything of all the children, including the boys, and she had been running the family by then for 3 years. She had brown hair she kept in a single braid. She had her father's nose and her mother's mouth. I had been in the town 6 weeks when she came to the door of the boarding house where I was staying and asked me, in the doorway, whether I was the person about whom certain stories were being told. I said yes. She said she would like to discuss a bargain. We discussed a bargain. The discussion took 2 days. She was 18 years old, and the bargain she discussed was as good as the bargain a 40-year-old man would have discussed. Lars, tell me. He did. He told her about Lars. He told her about an October Saturday when the Hardacre boys had come up the road with 3 friends and a barrel and some bad intentions, and Astrid had asked Nate to do a thing, and Nate had done the thing. The thing he had done had been one specific intervention. The intervention had, as its effect, been the falling of a beam in a barn the Hardacre boys had been near. The beam had not been the part of the chaos he had intended. The chaos he had intended had been a frightening, not an injury. The beam had fallen because the chaos had moved through a structure in the barn that had been weak for 2 years, and the structure had moved because the chaos had touched it, and the beam had fallen because the structure had moved. The Hardacre boys had run. Lars had been on the south side of the barn, behind the beam, because Lars had also come to investigate, and Lars had been 22 and curious and a Halvorsen, and the beam had fallen on him. Lars had not died at the barn. He had died 9 days later in the house, with his sister Astrid on the chair by the bed. Nate did not embellish the story. He did not soften it. He did not, at any point, look at Maren during the telling. He looked at the table. When he finished, he picked up the contract and folded it, gently, on its 3 original creases. "She did not blame me for the beam," he said. "Or she did blame me for the beam, but she did not say she did. What she did was she sat at her father's kitchen table at 1 o'clock on the morning of the 9th day and wrote 11 clauses. I came to the door because she had called me. She handed me the paper. I signed." "You added the 11th line." "I added the 11th line." "You signed it thinking you would not see her again." "I signed it thinking I would not see her unless she chose to see me. She did not choose to see me for 101 years. She has chosen now." Maren was holding her mug. The mug was the Astrid mug, the 1991 one, with the brown glaze and the chip. She had been holding it for the last 6 minutes without drinking. The tea was the temperature it had been when she poured it. The kettle had not been on long enough to bring the water to a boil. The tea was warm. The tea would not get hot. The kettle, beside her elbow, ticked once. "My grandmother," Maren said. "Yes?" "My grandmother never said anyone's name in this kitchen unless she meant the name." "I know." "My grandmother held a 101-year-old grudge against you that no one in this family knew about because she did not want any of us to carry it for her." "I know." "My grandmother forgave you in pencil in 1962. "I do not know that. Anders has told you that, and I believe Anders. I was not in this town in 1962. I have not been in this town since 1924. She forgave you. I will not let myself believe that until I am sure she meant forgave, not forgave with conditions. That is the I will know in pencil. That is the I will know in pencil. I do not know whether she would have known in this kitchen today if she had been alive to know. I will not pretend I know." Maren set the mug down. She had been holding it. She had been holding it because she had not wanted to be in the room without something in her hands. She set it down because she did not, in this moment, want a thing in her hand. She wanted her hands free. She did not yet know for what. "Nate." "Yes?" "I would like you to keep living in the cottage." He looked up. He looked at her for a long second. He had taken his glasses off, and the small wire frames were sitting on the table beside the folded contract. And his eyes were the color Maren could not yet pin. "Maren, I am not asking you to stay because the contract says you have to. I am asking you to stay because the cottage has been locking itself, and because Wendell has not been biting you, and because my grandmother put 11 clauses on the table in 1924, and because I would like to know at the end of this what my grandmother meant by I will know. I would like to know with you." "All right. You may leave at any time." "All right. You will not leave." "No." She nodded once. He nodded once. Wendell, against the closed kitchen door, exhaled audibly, which from a wether was the equivalent of a long, satisfied sentence. The kettle began, very softly, to whistle again. The burner was off. The whistle was a single note that lasted 3 seconds and ended. At 3:40, Sigrid the llama walked into the office through the cat door, surveyed the kitchen from the doorway, decided the kitchen was off limits because the kitchen contained the contract, and lay down across the threshold beside Wendell with the absolute deliberateness of a llama who had elected herself the second sentinel of an event she had not been invited to. She put her head on Wendell's flank. Wendell, who normally would have bitten any llama who touched him, did not bite. They lay there in a row. At 4, Aunt Tove came in the office door with a stew pot in both hands, stepped carefully over Sigrid and Wendell at the threshold without comment, and stopped at the kitchen entrance. "I see you have read the document," she said. "Yes," Maren said. And Mr. Cantwell is going to keep living in the cottage." "Great," Aunt Tove said. She did not ask anything else. She set the stew on the back of the cold burner. She crossed the kitchen and took the folded contract from the table, examined the back of it as an old judge examines a deed, satisfied herself it had not been altered, and set it back down in the same place. She poured herself tea from the kettle without asking. She did not comment on the burner. She sat down at the third chair at the table. She picked up a biscuit from the plate Maren had arranged. She ate it. "Stale," she said. "Yes," Maren said. "Bryony brought them for the funeral. I have been holding the tin closed." "You are holding it open now." "I am." "Good." Wendell, against the closed kitchen door, exhaled once more. The kettle did not whistle a third time. The brown glaze on the Astrid mug caught the late afternoon, and Maren sat at her own kitchen table with her aunt and 102-year-old chaos demon, and the three of them ate Bryony's stale biscuits and drank tea that the cottage and the kettle and the burner and Astrid had between them brewed without asking any of them. Chapter 8. Mrs. Verleen Mott. Mrs. Verleen Mott. The charcoal suit in Oxford stepped out of a Spokane rental at 23 minutes past 11 on a Friday morning. Wendell tried to bite her. She was unbothered. The rental was a beige sedan from the airport. The woman was mid-50s. She had a leather briefcase, a clipboard tucked under her arm, and a brown lanyard around her neck that ended in an ID card flipped backward. She closed the driver's door behind her with the same precision a person uses to close a filing cabinet. She walked to the porch of the office. Wendell came out of the barn at a trot, made a beeline across the yard, and went for her left calf. The woman lifted her clipboard. The clipboard came down on Wendell's snout with the firm, careful tap a person uses to correct a child who has been told twice. Wendell stopped. He stepped back. He looked at her. "You are Wendell," she said. Wendell did not respond. Wendell's did not respond to questions. "I have been told to expect you," she said. She walked past him to the porch. Maren had been splitting kindling again. She had been splitting kindling for 2 weeks, in mounting protest against her own life. And she set the hatchet down and stood up. She had not been told to expect this. Maren Halvorsen. "Yes." "I am Mrs. Verleen Mott. I am here on the matter of Ignatius Cantwell. May I come in?" "Mrs. Mott." Verleen is also acceptable, although I prefer Mrs. Mott during the working day. "Mrs. Mott." "Yes." "What is your office?" "My office is in the matter you have been informed of. I will be happy to walk you through any specifics. I prefer to do so indoors, with tea, and with Mr. Cantwell present. I have driven from Spokane this morning. I have been driving since 7. I would appreciate the tea." Maren considered. She considered for exactly the length of time Astrid would have considered, which was the length of time between when the kettle was set on the burner and when it began, gently, to whistle. The kettle in the office, behind Maren, began very softly to whistle. The kettle was inside the office. The kettle was on the burner. The burner was off. Maren had not been in the office for 15 minutes. "Come in," Maren said. "Thank you." Mrs. Mott came in. She wiped her Oxfords carefully on the doormat. She did not, as a person would have done in a friendlier office, look around. She walked to the kitchen with the directness of a woman who had been to many kitchens. Nate had come up from the cottage at the sound of the rental's tires. He was already in the office doorway. He stopped when he saw Mrs. Mott. "Mr. Cantwell." "Mrs. Mott." "I do not believe we have met." "We have not. You have been with my department's contracts for some time. I have read your file. I would like very much to have tea. Maren is making it. Excellent. She sat down at the kitchen table without being invited, set her briefcase on the floor beside her chair where an attorney sets a briefcase, placed the clipboard face down on the table, and unclipped her pen from the lanyard. The pen was a Bic she had bought, Maren would guess, at a Spokane drugstore on the drive-in. Mrs. Mott did not strike Maren as a person who had bought a Bic at a Spokane drugstore on the drive-in. Mrs. Mott struck Maren as a person who had been carrying that specific Bic since 1994 and would continue to carry it until something serious happened to the pen. The kettle whistled. Maren took it off. She poured tea into 3 of Astrid's old chipped mugs because she could not bring herself in this hour to use the wobble mug or the brown glaze. She set sugar and lemon on the table. She sat down. Nate sat down at the 3rd chair and kept his coat on. He picked up his mug and held it with both hands, palms flat against the sides, as a person holds a teacup when they have been cold for a long time. Mrs. Mott looked at his hands on the mug. "Mr. Cantwell," she said. "Yes." "Are you cold?" "It is a habit." "All right." She turned over her clipboard. "I am here on the matter of the Halvorsen-Cantwell contract of 1924, she said. "The contract has been on my department's calendar since 1962, when Mrs. Astrid Halvorsen filed a written codicil with our records office. The codicil added a clause that has not, until this month, been operative. The contract entered its 2nd phase upon Mrs. Halvorsen's death. We are conducting a routine check-in. I would like to begin by asking Mr. Cantwell 3 questions. I will then ask Miss Halvorsen 1. I will then leave. The drive to Spokane is 6 hours, and I would like to be on the 7 o'clock back." Maren said, "All right." Mrs. Mott said, "Mr. Cantwell, first question. Have you, in the last 14 days, performed an action that has caused harm to any person, animal, or piece of property in the town of Halloran's Tide?" "No." Second question. Have you been asked to perform such an action by any person, animal, or piece of property in the town of Halloran's Tide? "Burger Halvorsen, on Tuesday last, asked me to assist him in a complaint against his sister. I declined." "You declined?" "Yes." Third question. Are you, at the present time, planning to perform such an action? "No." Mrs. Mott made 3 small marks on her clipboard. The marks were neither ticks nor checks. They were a small symbol Maren had never seen before, which Maren suspected was specific to Mrs. Mott's department, and which she would not be told the meaning of. Mrs. Mott looked up. "Mr. Cantwell, this is the routine portion of the visit. I am going to now address the codicil. I am required to ask Miss Halvorsen the next question because Miss Halvorsen, as Mrs. Halvorsen's executor and heir, has standing in this contract." "All right," Maren said. "Miss Halvorsen." "Yes." The codicil filed by Mrs. Halvorsen in 1962 reads as follows. In the event that Ignatius Cantwell, during his residency in Halloran's Tide, forms an emotional attachment in this town that exceeds the weight of the original debt, he is required to return to the office of his previous employer for review. I am required to ask whether, in your judgment, Mr. Cantwell has formed an emotional attachment that exceeds the weight of the original debt." Maren did not answer immediately. Through the kitchen window, the fog was coming in. The fog at 11 in the morning was unusual. The fog at 11 in the morning had been unusual for 2 days. The fog was settling on the bluff in a way that suggested it was being held in place by a small, slow agency that was not the bluffs. The radiator on the south wall of the office pinged once. "What weight is the original debt?" Maren said. Mrs. Mott considered. "That is not a question I am authorized to answer. Mrs. Halvorsen specified the weight in a private instrument that is on file at the department. The specification is sealed. I have not read it. You are asking me to compare an attachment to a weight you cannot tell me. I am asking you to make a judgment based on your own knowledge of the contract and of Mr. Cantwell. The judgment is one of 3 judgments that will be considered. The other 2 are Mr. Cantwell's and the department's. Yours is the operative one. I am asking it of you because the codicil names you. The codicil names you because, at the time it was written, Mrs. Halvorsen anticipated her granddaughter would be the executor at the time of activation. My grandmother wrote a clause anticipating I would have to make this judgment. Yes. In 1962. Yes. She did not know me in 1962. She had a sense of you. Maren did not answer for a long time. She drank her tea. The tea was the temperature it had been when she had poured it. It had not cooled. It had not heated further. It was the temperature of tea that had been brought into being by a kettle that was no longer on a burner. Nate had not moved his hands from the mug. She set her own mug down. She put her hands flat on the table. Mrs. Mott. Yes? Have I formed an emotional attachment to Mr. Cantwell that exceeds the weight of the original debt? That is the question. I have known Mr. Cantwell for 16 days. Yes. In those 16 days, he has lived in my cottage and worked my barn and walked my coastal trek with me and a family of 4 and a wether. He has not broken anything. He has not, with the exception of 1 fixed leak and 1 moved pack strap, done a thing I did not ask for. He has read my grandmother's contract. He has answered every question my Aunt Tove has asked him at this kitchen table. He has held a teacup with both hands. I have decided that the question of whether I have an emotional attachment to Mr. Cantwell that exceeds the weight of a debt my grandmother specified in a sealed instrument in 1962, when she did not know me and could not have known the year would be 2026, is not a question I am willing to answer in this kitchen on a Friday morning to a woman with a clipboard. Miss Halvorsen, that is my answer. Mrs. Mott considered. That is, in fact, an acceptable answer. The codicil does not require a yes or a no. The codicil requires a judgment. The judgment of, I am not willing to answer this question to a person with a clipboard on a Friday morning is in our records classified as a not yet. I will mark not yet. The codicil enters an observation period. How long? 90 days from today. After which I or a colleague will return and ask again. And in the meantime, Mr. Cantwell is to continue residency under the original terms. Mr. Cantwell is not to be relieved of the residency under any circumstance, including his own request. Ms. Halvorsen is not to be required to make a binding statement of any kind. The contract continues as written. The codicil is an observation. Understood. Mrs. Mott made 1 more mark on her clipboard. She unclipped a small business card from a side pocket of the clipboard and set it on the table beside Maren's mug. My card, she said. You may call me at any hour. I prefer the morning. I will be back, or a colleague will be back, in 90 days. Thank you for the tea. She stood up. She picked up her briefcase. She tucked the clipboard under her arm. She did not look at Nate as she walked out of the kitchen. She walked past the porch, past Wendell, past the barn, and to her rental. She got in. She closed the door. The car backed out. The car drove off. The fog began to lift. The kitchen radiator pinged twice and went quiet. Maren picked up Mrs. Mott's card. The card was a blank rectangle of stiff white stock on which was printed in small black letters the name Verleen Mott and 1 phone number. There was no agency, there was no department, there was no title, there was no address. She put the card under the salt cellar on the table. Nate. Yes. On the bluff above the cottage. Yes. Are my cousins on the bluff? Sigrid is in human form on the porch of the cottage. Birger is in llama form behind the cottage. They have been trying for 20 minutes to come through the cottage wall. The cottage has not let them. You can see them from where you are sitting. I have known they were there since Mrs. Mott arrived. The cottage has known. The cottage has been holding them. The cottage released them 3 minutes ago. They have come up to the cottage porch. Sigrid is sitting on the bench. All right. Maren. Yes. The cottage did not want them to be in the house while Mrs. Mott was here. I know. The cottage decided that on its own. I know. That. He set the mug down. He had been holding it with both hands for the entire interview. The mug was empty. The fog had lifted from the bluff entirely now, and the gray of the day had become the lighter gray of an early afternoon. Wendell, on the porch of the office, had not moved from where he had stationed himself the moment Mrs. Mott had stepped out of the rental. Wendell was now lying down. Wendell exhaled. Maren stood up. She picked up the contract from where Aunt Tove had set it down yesterday. She walked to the office desk, opened the lower drawer, set the contract inside, and closed the drawer. She came back to the kitchen. Sigrid was sitting on the bench at the cottage porch, with the look of a woman who had been thwarted by a wall and intended to file a complaint with the wall's superiors. Birger was behind her, in human form, with his shirt on backwards. Maren looked at Nate. Lunch, she said. Yes. And then I would like to walk to the bluff with you and tell you about my grandmother's older brother. Not what you have already told me. What I have always known. Yes. Wendell, on the porch, exhaled again. The radiator pinged once. Mrs. Mott's blank card sat under the salt cellar. The kettle, on the cold burner, hummed once on a note Maren had not heard before, and then it stopped. Chapter 9. After Hours. Maren took 2 enamel cups of cocoa out to the bunkhouse porch at 9:30 that night. Nate was on the bench. She set the cups down between them, and he told her about 1924 a second time, in a sentence she had not been ready for in the kitchen, and was ready for now. She had walked him to the bluff at 3. They had stood at Astrid's looking spot, at the flat stone 3 feet from the cliff edge where Astrid had stood every morning of her adult life. And Maren had told Nate the Astrid she had grown up with. She had told him about the kettle on the back of the cold burner and the cigarette burn on the kitchen table at the corner, and the year Astrid had thrown out every chair in the cottage and replaced them with 3 benches Astrid had decided were the only acceptable seating in a guest room. She had told him about the pencil patterns on the back of envelopes. She had told him about the Norwegian word for come, and the specific drop into the second syllable that, when Astrid used it, meant a thing was over. She had told him about the year Maren had been 12, and Astrid had taught her to read a barometer by ear, and the year Maren had been 14, and Astrid had told her, on this bluff, in this place, that the responsible one was a position one chose, and not a sentence one was given. She had not told him Astrid had been wrong about that. Nate had not interrupted. He had not asked questions. He had sat down on the flat stone halfway through and had stayed sitting, in his coat, with his hands on his thighs. At the end of the telling, he had stood up, and they had walked back together to the office. Aunt Tove had been at the office. She had cooked them dinner. The dinner was the dinner Astrid had made on the second Sunday of every month for 50 years. A fish stew with potatoes and dill, which Aunt Tove had not made once since Astrid had died, because Aunt Tove had been waiting for a Sunday when she would not be cooking it alone. The Sunday was not today. The day was a Friday, Aunt Tove had made the stew anyway. The three of them had eaten it. The bowls had been Astrid's. Wendell had been on the porch outside the kitchen window, watching them, in a posture that was the weather equivalent of a chaperone holding the door. Aunt Tove had left at 9. Maren had washed the dishes. Nate had dried them. They had not spoken. He had set the last bowl in the rack, taken his apron off, hung it on the hook Astrid had screwed into the wall beside the stove in 1968, and walked out to the porch. She had brought him cocoa. The fog bell from the harbor went off twice a minute. The porch boards under the bench were dry warm, sun-cured by a day that had not been hot, but had been steady. Wendell came up the path at 20 to 10 and lay down across Nate's feet, head on forepaws, as he had laid down on the first morning of the trek with the Park family asleep in their tents. Nate did not move his feet. "You came to me on the bluff," he said. "Today." "Yes." "You told me about a kitchen, a burn on a table, a barometer, a bench instead of a chair." "Yes." "You did not tell me one thing." "What thing?" "You did not tell me what your grandmother said to you on the bluff at 14, about the responsible one." Maren did not answer. She had been holding her cup. She set the cup down on the porch beside her boot. She looked at the harbor, which was not visible from the bench at this hour, because the fog had not yet cleared, and the porch lamp was the only working lamp on the bluff. The fog bell went off. "My grandmother said," she said, "that the responsible one was a position you chose. She was wrong." "All right." She was the responsible one her whole life because Lars died on the 9th day in the upstairs bedroom, and she was 20, and her father's leg did not work in winter, and her mother had not been the same since the beam, and she was the eldest daughter, and there was no one else. She did not choose that. She told me at 14 on the bluff that I had a choice. She did not have one. She wanted me to have one. And I made the same choice she did, and pretended it had been a choice. I have been the responsible one in this family for 33 years, because there has been no one else. Berger has, in his life, made one responsible decision, which was the decision in 2019 not to date a woman who was visibly going to ruin him. He has made no other. Sigrid is 28. She will get there. She is not there yet. She is not, I would like to be clear, on the path to be there in less than 10 years. Aunt Tove has her own land at her own cove and her own life, which she gave up to come down here for 9 months while Astrid was dying, and which she has been politely waiting to be allowed to return to since the funeral. Aunt Tove is 62. Aunt Tove has earned not being the responsible one anymore. So it is you. It is me. Maren. Yes? That is not what I came here to talk to you about. But I would like, before I say what I came here to say, to register that I have heard you. You came here to say a thing. I did. All right, say it. He thought about that. He had not picked his cocoa up. He had been letting it cool on the porch board between them. He picked it up now. He held it in both hands. He did not drink it. I have been doing the math of one action for 102 years, he said. I have been doing it because your grandmother asked me to. I have been doing it because I would have done it anyway. I have been doing it because at 1 a.m. on the night the action was done, she sat at her father's kitchen table and wrote 11 clauses and would not give me a cup of tea. And a person who has been not given a cup of tea by a woman doing 11 clauses understands, in the moment, that they will be doing math for a long time. I have been doing the math for 102 years. I have not solved the math. I came to this town 2 weeks ago expecting to do the math for another 100 years. She waited. I am no longer, he said, doing the math for another 100 years. What changed? You came to me on a bluff this afternoon and told me about a kitchen. Nate. That is what changed. Nate. I am required by the contract to do no harm until I have understood. I have, for 101 of these years, defined understood as solved. I have been waiting to solve it. I have been waiting for the solution to come in a way I could hand to your grandmother and have her say yes. That is what I needed. I am told today that your grandmother forgave me in pencil in 1962 and has been waiting only to know that I understand. I do not, in fact, know that I understand. But I know that for the first time in 102 years, I am not, today, defining the word understand as solve. I am defining it as something else. What? I am defining it as, I have begun to want things in this town that are not the things I came here to do. I am sorry. That is the closest I have come to it. I would like very much to keep wanting them. I would like very much to be allowed to want them. I would like, if it is acceptable to you, to allow myself to think of the next 90 days as a period in which I am not being held to the contract by the contract. Maren did not say anything for some time. The fog bell went off. Wendell exhaled. The porch lamp gave the cocoa cups a yellow rim, and gave Nate's hands a yellow rim, and gave Maren's boot a yellow rim. What do you want? She said. I would like to drink this cocoa. All right. I would like to drink it slowly. All right. I would like to sit on this bench while I drink it. All right. I would like, when I have finished drinking it, to say goodnight to you. I would like to say goodnight to you in a manner I have not said goodnight to anyone in 100 years. What manner? I do not yet know. I will be finding out. All right. He drank his cocoa. He drank it slowly. He drank it in the small, measured sips of a man for whom warm cocoa was a new thing. He held the cup, as he had held the teacup at the kitchen table, with both hands on the sides. The cocoa was warm. Wendell did not move. The fog bell went off twice. The porch lamp held steady. Nate, she said. Yes. Did you have warm cocoa often in your previous arrangement? No. Why? Cocoa was, in the strict sense, an indulgence the contract did not require. I had been, until 2 weeks ago, indulgence averse. I had also been, until 2 weeks ago, primarily in residence in places one does not order cocoa. The places have included a boarding house in Sacramento in 1948, a railway car between Chicago and Salt Lake in 1951, and an apartment above a fish supply warehouse in Tacoma between 1978 and last month. None of these served cocoa. You were in Tacoma until last month. I was in Tacoma until the 3rd of April. Anders Petrescu wrote me a letter at the address. The letter said your grandmother had died and the contract had entered its second phase. I packed. Anders has known where you lived. Anders has been forwarding letters to me at that address for 41 years. Anders Petrescu, attorney at law, has had your forwarding address since 1985. Yes. He has never mentioned this to me. No. That is the kindest thing Anders Petrescu has ever done for my family. And Anders Petrescu, I would like you to know, has done a number of very kind things for my family. I know. She did not say anything for a moment. Wendell, on the porch, shifted his weight by half an inch and resettled. The fog bell went off. When he had finished the cocoa, he set the cup down on the porch board. He turned on the bench. He was facing her. His knees did not touch hers because the bench was a porch bench Astrid had built in 1971 and was a longer bench than two people sitting on a couch would have allowed for. He was facing her with 12 inches of bench between them and the cocoa cups on the boards. He reached out his right hand. He did not take her hand. He took her wrist. He took her wrist by the sides, by the inner side and the outer side, with his thumb on the back of her wrist and his first two fingers on the soft inner, and not by the top. The grip was light. It was the grip a person uses to handle a piece of paper 100 years old. He held her wrist for a count of 3. He let it go. "Good night, Maren." "Good night, Nate." He stood. He picked up his cup. Wendell stood. They went into the cottage. The door closed gently. Maren sat on the bench for another minute. The fog bell went off. She picked up her own cup. She walked across the yard. She let herself into the office. The office was quiet. The kettle was off. The radiator was quiet. The drawer in the office kitchen, on her own counter, was closed. She set her empty cup down beside the sink. The drawer opened. It opened by itself with no sound and stayed open for a count of 2, and then closed. She walked over to the drawer. She opened it. The drawer contained nothing. She closed it. She stood at the sink. She held her own wrist with her own opposite hand, on the inner side and the outer side, with her thumb on the back. She held it for a count of 3. She let it go. She had not been wanting anything since 2015. She had been responsible for things, and she had been holding the family, and she had been opening the office at 6 o'clock on cold mornings and closing it at 10 o'clock at night, and she had been keeping the booking calendar in Astrid's handwriting open on the kitchen table. The last thing she had wanted, in any way she could put a name on, had been a flat white from Bryony's grandmother's kiosk on the morning of her divorce, which she had drunk standing on the dock at 6 a.m. in October, alone, and had not wanted anything since. She catalogued that. She catalogued it as she catalogued the booking calendar. She did not yet have a name for what she had begun to want tonight. She put the catalog on the counter beside the wobble mug and the saucerless teaspoon, and she did not, in this moment, try to name it. She turned off the kitchen light. She went up to bed. She turned off her own kitchen light. From the office stairs, she could see the cottage across the yard. The porch lamp held steady. Wendell had not moved from across the doormat. The fog bell went off again. Out at the harbor, a long, low fog blew over the bluff and lifted, and the porch lamp on the cottage held its yellow rim against the gray of the night, and behind the closed cottage door, a small sound. A drawer opening on its own, a saucer set down, a lamp clicking off, came across the yard at intervals only the cottage was keeping. Maren took her boots off at the top of the stairs and did not, before she got into bed, manage to be entirely sad. Chapter 10. Hardacre. The legal notice came on Hardacre Development letterhead in a manila envelope on Wednesday morning. It said the grazing easement across the southern Hardacre Cove was suspended, effective immediately, pending review. Stapled to the back was a separate complaint, filed in Superior Court on Tuesday afternoon, alleging wrongful death in the matter of Lars Halvorsen, deceased 1924, on behalf of the Hardacre estate. Maren read it twice at the kitchen table. She did not get up. The trekking season opened on Saturday. The Southern Cove was the second leg of the coastal loop. 3 bookings between now and June ran the southern leg. 2 of those 3 had been booked 12 months in advance. The easement had been in continuous use since 1934. Astrid had paid the Hardacre estate $48 a year for the use, in a private agreement that had been honored by 3 generations of Hardacres and 1 current Hardacre, who had been honoring it on inertia until 8 days ago. She read the wrongful death complaint. It was 3 pages. The first page was a recitation of public record facts about the 1924 barn beam and Lars. The second page was a paragraph attributing the beam to a man named Ignatius Cantwell, identified as a transient laborer of no fixed address, currently in residence at Halvorsen property. The third page was a request for damages and a request that Mr. Cantwell be removed from Halvorsen property, pending the outcome of the suit. Mrs. Lindquist called the office at 9:15. Maren. Mrs. Lindquist. Quentin Hardacre is in my store. He has been on my front porch for 2 hours. He has. He would like a meeting with you. He has asked me to call. He has asked me to pretend it was my idea to call. All right. I am not pretending it is my idea to call. I am calling because he is on my porch. All right. Maren. Yes. He is not in a posture I like. He is in the posture of a man who has been in his lawyer's office on Tuesday and has driven 2 hours to be on my porch this morning. I have not given him a coffee. I will give him a coffee if you want me to give him a coffee, but I am not going to give him a coffee on my own initiative. Tell him I'll be there at 10. All right. At 10, Maren parked at Mrs. Lindquist's general store, in the rain that had started at 8, and walked up the front steps under an umbrella Bryony had given her in 2019. Mrs. Lindquist had set a small table in the corner of the store between the dry goods aisle and the post office window, with 2 chairs and a thermos of coffee and 3 mugs. Mrs. Lindquist was at the counter on her stool, reading a catalog she was not actually reading. Quentin Hardacre was in one of the chairs. Maren had known him by sight since she was 16. He was, in 2026, 44 years old, 6 feet tall, in a wool coat she had not seen him wear in town before, and he was, as Mrs. Lindquist had said, in a posture. The posture was the posture of a man who had been in his lawyer's office on Tuesday. She sat. Miss Halvorsen. Mr. Hardacre. I assume you have read the notice. I have. I assume you have read the complaint. I have. I would like to discuss a settlement. Mr. Hardacre. Yes. My grandmother died 6 months ago. My grandmother was 18 years old in 1924. My grandmother's older brother died in 1924 because a beam fell on him in a barn on your grandfather's property after your grandfather had threatened our family. The threat is in our records. The beam is in our records. The settlement my grandmother accepted in 1924 is in our records. The settlement was $48 a year and the grazing easement across your family's southern cove. We have paid the $48 every year. We have used the easement every year. We have nothing further to settle. Ms. Halvorsen, the death of your great-uncle. I do not call him my great-uncle. I have known his name for 6 days. I will not be discussing him with you at a table in Mrs. Lindquist's store. Miss Halvorsen, what do you want, Mr. Hardacre? He considered. I want Mr. Cantwell removed from your property. My grandmother brought Mr. Cantwell to this town as part of a binding instrument she signed in 1924, which was filed with my attorney's predecessor and remains on file. Mr. Cantwell is on my property under terms that predate your interest in this matter by a century. Ms. Halvorsen, I have been told by sources that Mr. Cantwell is not what he appears to be. Mr. Hardacre, I have been told by my own family attorney that he is what he appears to be, which is a man who lives in a cottage on my property under a 1924 instrument. I do not know what your sources are. I do not need to know. Miss Halvorsen, I'm afraid that if Mr. Cantwell is not removed from your property within 7 days, the complaint will proceed. The easement suspension will continue. The Halvorsen trekking operation will not run the Southern Loop this season. Mr. Hardacre. Yes? You'd be telling Mrs. Lindquist about this, then. I am informing you of a sequence of events. That is the same thing. It is, I'm afraid, an informing. Mrs. Lindquist, at the counter, did not turn a page of her catalog. Maren stood up. She picked up the mug of coffee she had been holding the whole conversation and had not drunk from. She set the mug back down on the table. She put a $5 bill on the counter at Mrs. Lindquist's elbow. She walked out the front door of the store, opened her umbrella on the porch, and walked down the front steps to her truck. She did not look at Quentin Hardacre. She did not look at Mrs. Lindquist. Mrs. Lindquist, when Hardacre had finished his coffee 15 minutes later and was walking down the steps to his own truck, did not say goodbye to him. She finished her catalog. She set it down. She picked up the phone. She called Aunt Tove. Aunt Tovey came down to the cannery at 1 in the afternoon, with the rain still falling, in her work boots and her oilskin, and a pot of soup she had not been planning to make but was now making. Birger arrived at 1:30, in human form, in his '92 Chevy, soaked. Sigrid arrived 10 minutes after Birger, also in human form, also soaked, with a 30-pack of canned soup and an expression that suggested she had been told this was no longer a llama afternoon. Bryony arrived at 2. Anders Petrescu arrived at 2:30 with a file box. The office was full of Halvorsens. Maren had not called the meeting. The meeting had called itself. She had taken her coat off only once between 10 and 2, and her hair was wet, and she had not put on a kettle. The kitchen kettle sat on a cold burner with the burner off and was, on every honest inspection, only a kettle on a cold burner, not whistling, not warm. She had been pretending not to notice. She noticed now, because Birger was at the counter pouring himself the cup of coffee he had been waiting 2 hours for, and the kettle did not respond. It did not even quiver. The needle on the cottage's mood, Maren thought, if there had been one, would have been dropping like Astrid's old wall barometer before a storm, slowly, in long, quiet jumps no one in the room wanted to acknowledge. Maren set the legal notice on the kitchen table. She set the wrongful death complaint beside it. She set Mrs. Mott's blank card beside that, because Mrs. Mott was, in the most distant sense she could imagine, also a stakeholder in this kitchen. One after another, Aunt Tove, Birger, Sigrid, Bryony, and Anders took off their coats and sat at the kitchen table. Nate did not. He was on the porch. He had come up from the cottage when the first truck had pulled in, stopped at the edge of the porch, looked at the door without opening it, and sat down on the porch bench. He had been there an hour. Wendell was lying down beside him in the rain, which Wendell, in 11 years of life, had never voluntarily done, and was not moving. Maren, through the kitchen window, could see them both. They were 2 shapes on the porch, a man in a brown coat with his hands on his thighs and a wether at his left boot. And the rain was falling on the brim of his hat, and he was not moving, and Wendell was not moving, and the kettle was cold on the cold burner. "He has to come in," Birger said. "He cannot come in," Aunt Tove said. "Why?" "Because Maren's kitchen has 5 Halvorsens in it, and our family is, at the present moment, debating his removal. He is, correctly, not in the debate. He is going to be soaked. He is. Aunt Tove." "Birger, he is not coming in until the conversation has been had. The conversation has not been had." Birger sat down. Anders Petrescu opened his file box. He set out the original contract. He set out a copy of the wrongful death complaint. He set out a copy of the easement suspension notice. He set out a 1934 letter from the Hardacre estate to Astrid in iron gall ink, agreeing to the $48 grazing arrangement. He set out a 1924 letter from Astrid to the Hardacre estate in Astrid's adult handwriting, declining the offer of cash compensation for Lars's death and proposing the easement instead. He set out a 1924 coroner's report. He set out a 1924 newspaper clipping. He set out, finally, a 1925 photograph of Astrid at 19, standing on the porch of the cannery, holding the deed to the property in her right hand and the easement letter in her left. The photograph was the last item in the box. "This is what we have," Anders said. "Anders," Aunt Tove said. "Yes? What can he do?" "To Maren? Legally? Very little. The complaint will not survive a motion to dismiss. The wrongful death cause of action is barred under the statute of repose by approximately 98 years. The easement suspension is a different matter. He has the property right to suspend, pending review. He can drag the review for a season. He cannot, by means of the suspension or the complaint, force Mr. Cantwell to leave Maren's property. He can, by means of the suspension and the complaint, ruin Maren's trekking season." "How long until you can have the complaint dismissed?" 2 weeks, possibly 3. "How long until the easement is restored?" "He can keep the suspension going for 60 days without a hearing. After 60 days, he has to file a substantive basis. He has not yet filed a substantive basis. He is bluffing." "How likely is the bluff to work?" "Depends on Maren." Maren had been standing at the kitchen window. She turned around. "What do we want?" she said. "We want what Astrid wanted," Aunt Tove said. "We want the easement restored, the complaint dismissed, and Quentin Hardacre to go back to his office in Mount Vernon. We do not want Mr. Cantwell harmed by the proceeding. We do not want Mr. Cantwell asked to leave." Astrid did not anticipate this. Astrid anticipated everything. Astrid anticipated this exactly. Astrid wrote a paragraph at the bottom of her testament that her granddaughter would inherit a working business and a 100-year-old grudge, and that the working business would be tested by the grudge. The testament is on Anders's desk. He read it to you. You were not, on the day he read it to you, hearing it. "All right. Maren. All right." Aunt Tove looked at her. "What do you want?" Aunt Tove said. Maren did not answer at first. She had her hand on the cold kettle. The kettle was cold. The cottage drawer in her office kitchen, the drawer behind her, was closed. The cottage drawer in the bunkhouse cottage, 50 feet down the path, she could not see from here. She suspected it was also closed. She suspected the cottage was, at the moment, uncertain. Bryony was watching her from across the table. "Halvorsen. Bryony, you have not eaten today. I am going to make Aunt Tove's soup hot, and you are going to eat it, and we will keep going after. Tired Maren is not the same person as fed Maren, and the next decision is for fed Maren." "Bryony. Halvorsen." Maren let her. Bryony stood, took Aunt Tove's soup pot from the cold burner, set it on the lit one, and stood at the stove with her hand on the handle until it was warm. She brought Maren a bowl. Maren ate. The bowl was Astrid's, the soup was Aunt Tove's, and the hand that had set the bowl down was Bryony's. 3 women's work in the same hour, which had not happened in this kitchen since Astrid died. Through the window on the porch, Nate had not moved. She wanted, for the count of 2 breaths, for him to come into the kitchen. She wanted him to come into the kitchen and put his hand on the kettle and have the kettle do what the kettle had been doing for a week, which was boil on its own when the household needed boiling. She wanted him to interrupt the conversation. She wanted him to fix the leak, as he had fixed the trough leak on his first morning, with a small chaos move that did not register as chaos. She wanted him to act. She registered the wanting. The wanting was a problem. The wanting was, in fact, the entire problem. If he acted now, if he so much as fixed the kettle, or paid Hardacre a visit at the general store, or did one small chaos-shaped thing, Mrs. Mott's clause activated. The codicil said, "If Mr. Cantwell forms an emotional attachment in Halloran's tide that exceeds the weight of the original debt," acting on Maren's behalf in this kitchen this afternoon would not be a question of debt weight. It would be the activation. He would be gone in 90 days or less. She wanted him to act. She wanted him to act because she had been the responsible one for 33 years and she was tired. She did not say it. "I want Astrid's easement," she said. "I want the complaint dismissed. I want the trekking season to run. I want Mr. Cantwell to stay in his cottage and do exactly nothing for the next 2 weeks." "All right," Aunt Tove said. "Can he do nothing for 2 weeks? He has done nothing for 2 weeks already." "Aunt Tove." "He has, Maren. He has done nothing for 2 weeks. He will do nothing for 2 more weeks. He will keep being the person you have noticed he is." "I know." "All right." Aunt Tove stood up, went to the cold kettle, picked it up, and set it on the lit burner she had quietly turned on at some point in the last sentence. She stood with her hand on the handle. The kettle did not respond. It was a kettle on a hot burner, and it was going to boil now because Aunt Tove had turned the burner on, and not for any other reason. It boiled in 11 minutes, which was the correct number of minutes for a kettle of that size to boil on that burner with no charm assistance. The cottage was uncertain. The rain on the tin roof of the office was the dense, steady rain of a Pacific Northwest May. The rain that would last another 6 hours and would not let up until midnight, and would soak the porch and the bench and the man on the bench and the wether at his boot. And Maren made tea for the 5 Halvorsens at her table, and she did not bring a cup to the porch. She had decided that not bringing a cup to the porch was the only kindness available to her this afternoon. Outside, on the bench, in the rain, Nate held his hands on his thighs and did not move. Wendell, beside him, exhaled once. In the cottage, 50 feet down the path, the drawer was closed. The kettle on the cold burner in the cottage was on its side. Chapter 11. Behaving. Nate found the brake line cut at 5:40 in the morning. Wendell was at his left boot. Hardacre's pickup was already coming up the bluff road. He had been on the trekking truck on a thing he had not been asked to do. He had walked out of the cottage at 5:30 because he had not slept since Wednesday. He had not slept since the rain. He had walked to the barn in the gray of pre-dawn because the gray of pre-dawn was an hour Astrid had used, and he had decided last night that he was going to use it. He had checked the working pack. He had checked the trough. He had walked the trekking truck because the truck was scheduled out at 6:30 to take Otto and Wendell and 4 of the working pack to the trailhead for Saturday's loop, and Maren had said the night before, to Aunt Tove in the kitchen, without looking at the porch, that she would drive the truck herself. He had walked the truck because he had not been able to stand the thought of the truck. The brake line was cut clean at the second junction under the driver's side wheel well, with a small ratcheting tool, a coat pocket tool, the sort a person brings on a job. The cut was visible only from under the truck, where Nate had been. He stood up and looked at his hands. They were not chaos-shaped. He was being very careful about his hands. Behind him, Wendell exhaled. A man stepped out of the brush at the south edge of the property with a wrench in his right hand. Not a man Nate had seen before. A hired man, holding the wrench at his side as he took 2 steps toward the barn doors. Wendell moved. He crossed the yard at a run no one had seen out of him in years. 240 pounds, 11 years old, 40 years worth of declining to forget being bitten by a yearling stranger in 1986. And he hit the hired man in a sideways shoulder and neck check from the man's right. The man went over the low gravel embankment, 4 feet of bluff and 2 feet of beach and a foot of water, and landed in the bay. He would not drown. He would, in about 90 seconds, climb back out and walk soaked down the bluff road to wherever Hardacre's pickup had let him off. Wendell stopped at the edge of the embankment. He looked over. He turned around. He walked back to Nate's left boot. The wrench was on the gravel where it had landed. Nate looked at the wrench. He looked at Wendell. He did not pick the wrench up. Behind him, on the bluff road, Hardacre's pickup rounded the second switchback. Maren had come out of the office at the sound of the bay splash. She was on the porch in her coat and her boots and the hat she had been keeping by the door. She had not been asleep. She had not been asleep since Wednesday night, either. Her hair was braided. She had a cup of coffee in her hand that she had been holding since 5:15 and had not drunk. She walked across the yard. Nate. Maren. The truck. Brake line. The line at the second junction. The man is in the bay. Wendell put him there. Wendell. All right. She looked at the truck. She looked at the wrench. She looked at the embankment. She looked at the bay. The man was, in fact, climbing back out of the bay, in the slow, careful steps of a man who had not expected to be in the bay and was now figuring out, while soaked, how angry he was. He was angry. He had not yet decided what to do about it. He was going to walk down the bluff road. The pickup came up to the gate. Quentin Hardacre got out. He was in the same wool coat he had been wearing at Mrs. Lindquist's store. He had not slept either. He had driven from Mount Vernon in the dark. He stopped at the gate. He did not come in. He looked at Wendell. He looked at the man on the beach. He looked at the truck. He looked at Maren. He looked at Nate. He did not look at any of them with confidence. He had come up the bluff road in a posture he had practiced, the wool coat and injunction posture, the man of business posture, and the posture had not survived the first 10 seconds at the gate. "Mr. Hardacre," Maren said. "Miss Halvorsen, your man is on my beach." "He is not my man." "He is not, Mr. Hardacre. Your man is on my beach. I have a deputy on the way. I called him at 5:42. He will be here in 9 minutes. Your man's wrench is on my gravel. The wrench will go to evidence. My truck is going to need a forensic look. You may stand at my gate. You may not come onto my property." "Miss Halvorsen." "Mr. Hardacre." He stood at the gate. 2 trucks were coming up the bluff road behind his pickup. The first was Aunt Tove's. The second was Anders Petrescu's. Aunt Tove had been on her way down at 5:30 because Maren had texted her at 5:15 with a single word, "Come." Anders had been at his office since 4 because Anders had not been sleeping either. They had pulled out of town together. Aunt Tovey parked her truck on the bluff road behind Hardacre's pickup, which had the effect of blocking the pickup from reversing. Anders parked behind Aunt Tovey. The bluff road was now a column of trucks. Birger and Sigrid arrived at 5:48 from the north end of the bluff. They were llamas, had been since 2 in the morning, when Sigrid had read Maren's 1:55 family group text and decided that 200-pound llamas were the appropriate form for the morning. Birger had agreed. They had walked 4 miles in the dark, and they came in past Maren and Nate without looking at either of them, went directly to Hardacre's pickup, stationed themselves at the door handles, and lay down. The pickup was not going anywhere. Hardacre, at the gate, looked at the llamas. "Miss Halvorsen." "Yes." There are llamas at my truck. Yes. They appear to be lying down. Yes. In a manner that suggests they have done this before. They have done this before. They did it to a beach photographer my grandmother did not like in 1994. All right. Aunt Tove came up the bluff path from her truck. Anders came up behind her with his file box. They arrived at the gate. Aunt Tove stopped 2 paces behind Maren. Anders set the file box down on the porch of the office and opened it. He took out 3 documents: the 1925 agreement between Astrid Halvorsen and Robert Hardacre, the 1924 coroner's report on Lars, and a 1934 letter Astrid had written to the Hardacre estate, enclosing the first year's $48 grazing payment. He laid them on the porch boards in chronological order. He took a step back. The documents were Maren's now. She walked to the porch. She picked them up. She walked back to the gate without looking at Aunt Tove, at Anders, or at Nate. She looked at Quentin Hardacre. Mr. Hardacre. Miss Halvorsen. Your grandfather threatened my great-grandfather in October of 1924. I know this because I have the affidavit my great-grandfather filed with the county the following week. The affidavit is in the file box on the porch. You also know it. You have known it since 1979, when your great-uncle Howard, on his deathbed, told you the parts of the story your mother had not believed. Yes. Your grandfather signed a paper in February of 1925, agreeing never to threaten the Halvorsens again and to allow our pack the use of the Southern Cove for $48 a year. The paper is in my hand. The paper is countersigned by my grandmother at 18. The paper has been honored by 3 generations of Hardacres and 1 current Hardacre on inertia for 101 years. I know this. You also know it. I do. You knew, on Tuesday, when you filed the wrongful death complaint, that it would not survive a motion to dismiss. Anders has explained the statute of repose to your attorney 3 times in 72 hours. He agreed on the 3rd explanation. You also knew the easement suspension would not survive 60 days without a substantive filing you have no substantive basis for. I'm afraid I did. What did you not know? He looked at her. I did not know your aunt would come down at 5:30. My aunt is 62 and was on the road by 5:20 because I asked her to be. What else did you not know? I did not know there would be llamas at my truck. My cousins have been llamas since 2 in the morning. They are Halvorsens. They were going to be llamas regardless of what I asked. What else? I did not know the man I hired would be in the bay. Wendell put him there. Wendell is a Halvorsen wether, and he made the decision on his own. What else? He had to think about that one. I did not know, he said, that I would be standing at your gate today doing this. No. I have been carrying my great-uncle Howard's story for 47 years. I know. You have been carrying it as my grandmother carried the story of her brother for 101 years, by holding to a paper. You are going to put yours down now. I am going to put mine down. And I am going to do something you have not seen a Halvorsen do. She handed the 3 documents back to Aunt Tove without speaking. She walked to the porch of the office and undressed in the careful, unhurried order Astrid had taught her at 22. Coat on the railing, boots on their sides beside it, the rest folded neatly on the bench. She walked back across the yard. She walked back to the gate as a llama. 250 pounds. The same llama she had been in the clearing on the trail. The same llama she had refused since she was 22 to let anyone see her as. She walked past Aunt Tove and Anders without looking at them. She walked past Hardacre's pickup. Birger stood up. Sigrid stood up. Maren the llama took her place at the front bumper, Birger to her left and Sigrid to her right, and the 3 Halvorsens stood in a line in front of Quentin Hardacre's truck. Hardacre did not move. He had been told on his great-uncle's deathbed what Halvorsens were, told by a frightened man who had been dismissed for 41 years, told a thing his mother had not believed. He was looking at it. Aunt Tove walked over with Maren's coat and boots in hand. Maren the llama exhaled, turned, walked back to the porch steps, and waited. Aunt Tove set the clothes on the steps and walked back to the gate. Maren shifted back. She dressed in the unhurried order, with the dignity Astrid had used at every age between 22 and 62. She braided her hair with the elastic in her coat pocket. She picked up the 3 documents from where Aunt Tove had set them down on the porch railing, and she walked back to the gate, and she stood in front of Quentin Hardacre. Mr. Hardacre, Miss Halvorsen, I am going to do 3 things. I am going to hand you the 1925 agreement, which you will take to your attorney this afternoon, and which will result in a stipulation by close of business withdrawing the wrongful death complaint, restoring the easement, and waiving any future claim in perpetuity. I am going to hand you the coroner's report, which my grandmother kept because she felt your family was owed it. I am going to hand you the 1934 letter, the first one my grandmother wrote to your grandfather, which explains in your grandfather's own correspondence file what she felt the bargain was. I am not going to apologize to you today, and I am not going to accept an apology from you. I am going to ask you to take these and go home. She held the 3 documents out. Hardacre took them. His hands were not steady. He did not pretend they were. Miss Halvorsen. Yes. All right. All right. He looked at the 3 Halvorsens in human form on his side of the gate, at the 2 llamas on the other side at his truck, at the wether at Nate's left boot, and last, at Nate himself. Nate had not moved. He had been at the side of the trekking truck the entire time, hands on his thighs, Wendell at his left boot, and he had not picked up the wrench, had not said a word since Maren had come out of the office. The brake line was still cut. "You're him," he said. "Yes." "You're Cantwell." "Yes." "You did the thing to my grandfather's barn in October of 1924. "I did." My great-uncle Howard was 11 years old. He saw it from the road. He had been sent up by my grandmother to fetch my grandfather home for dinner. He stopped at the bend in the road, the one above the south pasture, because he saw something he did not understand in the barnyard. He saw a man take his coat off in October. He saw the man set the coat down on a stump. He saw the man walk to the barn. He saw the barn move. Nate did not interrupt. Howard was, until he was a grown man, a boy who would not say a word at the table. The barn made him quiet for 30 years. He told my mother when he was 41. She told him he had imagined it. He told me on his deathbed in 1979, because she was no longer alive to disagree. He told me the man had been thin and unremarkable and was wearing a brown coat with 5 buttons, second from the top being slightly looser than the others. He told me the man had not seen him on the road. He told me he had been waiting his whole life for someone to believe him. He told me to look for the man if he ever came back. He said the man would come back when his contract came due. He told me the contract. Your great-uncle was on the road. He was. I did not see him. You would not have. He was on the road. The barn was on the rise. He was a child. He went home and he told my mother, and my mother did not believe him, and he told me 40 years later. He told me on his deathbed, Cantwell. Nate considered. I did not know there had been a witness, he said. There was. All right. What do you have to say to me? Nate took a breath. He did not look at Maren. He did not look at Anders. He did not look at Aunt Tove. he looked at Quentin Hardacre. He was 40 feet away. The bay was below them. The fog had not come up yet. The bluff at dawn smelled of salt and wet wool from the barn and the cold tin of the trekking truck in the gravel. "I owe your family nothing under the terms of any law I am answerable to," he said, voice very level. "I am, today, going to say a thing to you that is not a piece of a transaction. I am going to say it because it is true. Your great-uncle Howard saw a thing in October of 1924 that no 11-year-old should have had to see. I did not see him on the road. I would have done the action differently if I had. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for the boy who died. I am sorry for the 11-year-old who was sent up to fetch his grandfather home for dinner. I am sorry for your mother, who did not believe him. I am sorry for the deathbed. I am, finally, sorry for the part of your inheritance that is my fault. The part that has put you at this gate at 6 a.m. with a man in the bay. I will be sorry for these things as long as I exist." Hardacre did not answer. He looked at the 3 documents in his own hands. He looked at the llamas at his pickup. He looked at the wrench on the gravel. He looked at Nate. After a long time, he said, "All right." He walked back to his pickup without speaking, the 3 documents in his right hand. Birger and Sigrid, after a count of 30, stood up and walked into the yard and went into the barn. The pickup was free. Hardacre sat in it for a long minute before he started the engine, reversed slowly, and drove down the bluff road. He did not look back. The deputy arrived 8 minutes later, took the wrench, photographed the brake line, and talked to Maren in the office with the kettle on a hot burner for 15 minutes. He left at 7:30. By 9, Anders had Hardacre's attorney on the phone. By 9:30, the easement suspension had been withdrawn, and the wrongful death complaint had been dismissed under a stipulation Anders drafted on the back of one of his own form letters, by which Hardacre Development paid Halvorsen Pack a token $48 in recognition of the 1925 agreement and waived any future claim to the matter in perpetuity. The attorney countersigned by fax. By 10, it was over. The Halvorsens were in the kitchen. Aunt Tove was making coffee, on the burner, with the burner on. Birger and Sigrid were sitting at the table in human form, eating eggs Aunt Tove had cooked. Anders was at the 3rd chair. Maren was on her feet by the kitchen window looking out at the yard. She turned around. "Birger! Sigrid!" They looked up. They had been eating eggs in a manner suggesting they had been doing so for the last 14 minutes without thinking about why. The trekking season opens Saturday. There are 8 bookings between Saturday and the end of June. I will not run them alone, and I will not run them with 2 cousins who decide to be llamas when a booking comes in they would prefer not to take. Birger, you are on the schedule for the Tuesday to Thursday loop next week. Sigrid, you are in the office on the booking calendar. Both of you will be in human form. Both of you will show up. If either of you cannot do this, I would like to know now, while I am drinking Aunt Tove's coffee, so that I can hire 2 other people before Wednesday. Birger had set his fork down. Maren. Birger. All right. Sigrid. Sigrid set her own fork down with exaggerated care. "Of course, cousin," she said sweetly. "Anything for the family business." Maren held her gaze for 3 seconds. "Sigrid." "Yes, Maren." Sincerely, Maren." "Thank you." Aunt Tove at the counter did not turn around. Her coffee was almost done. Nate was at the trekking truck. He had been at the trekking truck since the deputy had left. He was sitting on the running board. He had not come into the kitchen. He had not been asked. Maren walked out of the kitchen, across the office, across the porch, across the yard. She sat down on the running board next to him. "You did not act," she said. "I did not. You wanted to." "Yes." Wendell acted. "He did. He is a wether. He is not, as far as I know, in a binding instrument with my employer. The action was his own." Mrs. Mott's clause. "I did not act on attachment. I acted on understanding. The clause is, I think, satisfied. The contract is, I think, complete. And me. You." I shifted at the gate, in front of him. 11 years of not. I did that. You did. For myself. Not for the contract. Not for him. For me. Yes. All right. You can leave. Yes. All right. Maren. Yes. I am not leaving. All right. They sat on the running board for a while. Wendell was lying down in the barn doorway. Otto was nosing at his hay net. The wet wool of every coat on the property, the barn smell, hers, his, the coats on the hooks in the office, was the strongest smell on the bluff at 10 in the morning in May. The bay below them was quiet. The fog had not come up. Maren said, "I am going to the cottage." "All right." She stood. She crossed the yard. She went up the path to the bunkhouse cottage. The cottage door was unlocked. She opened it. The cottage was empty. Nate's suitcase was on the floor at the foot of the bed, flat on its bottom. The kettle was on the counter, upright. The hot plate was off. The drawer in the kitchen was open. The drawer contained one object. The object was a small brass key. The key was the key to a lock she had never seen. She picked the key up. The brass was warm. The key was newly made. The key was at least 100 years old. The two facts were the same fact. She closed her hand around the key. She walked out of the cottage. She walked back to the trekking truck. Nate was still on the running board. She sat down beside him. She opened her hand. She showed him the key. He looked at it. "I do not know what it opens," she said. "No." "You don't either." "No." "All right." He held his hand out, palm up, and she put the key in his palm, and he closed his fingers around it and held it for a count of 3. He opened his hand. He gave the key back to her. He did it slowly, as a person handles a piece of paper 100 years old. She closed her hand around the key. The bay was quiet. Wendell, in the barn doorway, exhaled. Chapter 12. What the drawer held. The key fit a lockbox at the back of Astrid's closet. The lockbox held a small leather diary dated October 1924. Maren opened the diary on the porch of the cottage with Nate beside her and read the entry aloud. A week had passed since the bluff at dawn. The trekking season had opened on the Saturday. The Park family had not been the first booking. The first booking had been a couple from Spokane who had been on a Halvorsen loop in 2019 and had asked, very politely, whether the deceased Mrs. Halvorsen's recipe for Camp Cocoa was still being used. Maren had said yes. The trek had run the southern leg without incident. The easement was, as Anders had restored it, restored. The wrongful death complaint had been withdrawn. The $48 token settlement had been deposited in the Halvorsen Pack operating account on Monday. Quentin Hardacre had not been seen in Halloran's Tide. Mrs. Lindquist had reported, on her own initiative, that Hardacre had given his notice at the Mount Vernon firm and had been seen with a moving truck in Bellevue. Mrs. Verleen Mott had not called. The cottage drawer had not opened by itself since the morning of the bluff. The cottage kettle had not boiled on its own since the morning of the bluff. The cottage had gone quiet, as a house goes quiet after holding something for a long time and setting the thing down. On the 7th morning after the bluff, Maren walked over to the cottage at 9 with 2 cups of coffee in her hands and asked Nate if he would help her clean out Astrid's old room. He said yes. Astrid's old room was at the back of the cottage, behind a door Maren had not opened in 14 years. Astrid had lived in the cottage for 2 summers in the late 90s before she had finally moved into the office house on a permanent basis, and she had kept the room as it had been the day she had moved out, which meant the room contained, in 2026, a single bed with a quilt Astrid had made in 1957, a small desk under the window, a chair, and a closet with 3 coats Astrid had not worn in 20 years. They opened the room together. They opened the windows. They sat on the bed. "My grandmother kept her papers in the office," Maren said. "Anything in this room is the part of her life that was not papers." "All right. I do not know what we are going to find." "All right. I would like to find it with you." "All right." They cleaned. They cleaned the desk first. The desk had 3 drawers. The drawers held, in order from top to bottom, a packet of postcards Astrid had received from her sister-in-law in 1968 and had answered with a single line each on the back, a small box of buttons which Astrid had been collecting since 1949 and which Maren had inherited the lid of, and a folded piece of muslin Maren had not been expecting, on which Astrid had embroidered, in her competent and unsentimental cross-stitch, a single sentence: "Take care of the weather." Maren had not known Astrid had ever embroidered. She set the muslin on the bed. They moved to the closet. The closet contained 3 coats and a hat. Astrid's red wool jacket from 1971, a green oilskin she had bought on a trip to Galway in 1985, a navy coat with brown buttons that Maren had not seen, and, on the top shelf at the back of the closet, behind a stack of folded sweaters Maren had never seen Astrid wear, a small metal lockbox. Maren took the lockbox down. She set it on the bed beside the muslin. The lockbox was painted black and was approximately the size of a shoebox. The lock plate was brass. The lock plate was the same brass as the drawer in the cottage kitchen, the lock that had appeared on the day Maren had come back from the trek and had not opened until the morning of the bluff. She took the brass key out of her coat pocket. She set it on the bed beside the lockbox. She did not insert the key for a moment. "I do not know what is in the box," she said. "No," Nate said. "My grandmother put it there at least 14 years ago. She did not give me the key. She did not give the key to Aunt Tove. She did not give the key to Anders. She put the key in the cottage drawer to come out on a morning of her choosing. The morning of the bluff was the morning of her choosing." "Yes, I would like to open it." "Yes." She inserted the key. The key turned. The lock opened. The box contained one object. The object was a small leather diary, brown, with a pressed flower under the cover plate, which the flower had been once a sprig of lavender and was now closer to a brown line. The diary was dated, in iron gall ink on the inside front cover, October 1924. Astrid had been 18 years old. Maren picked up the diary. She opened it at random. The handwriting was Astrid's, but it was the handwriting of an 18-year-old Astrid. Younger, smaller, more careful, less broken at the pencil tip than the Astrid of the contract margins, which had been written, the broken margins, the night Lars died, with the same handwriting at the start of the entries and the broken handwriting at the end. The diary was, then, the diary Astrid had kept from October 1st, 1924, through the day Lars died, and the day of the contract and the days after. Maren turned to the page Astrid had marked with a slip of ribbon. The ribbon was at the entry dated October 18th, 1924, which was the morning after the contract had been signed. She read it aloud. Lars died yesterday afternoon. Mr. Cantwell signed the paper at 1 a.m. I sat with him at the kitchen table for 1 hour. I did not give him tea. I did not because I knew that if I gave him tea, I would forgive him in this kitchen tonight, and I do not want to forgive him in this kitchen tonight. I want him to live with what he has done. I want to live with what I have done. I want both of us to know the weight. But I have lived already today with what I have done, and I do not want to live with it forever. I forgive him. I just need to know he understands. I will not tell him this. I will write it here. I will hold to the paper. I will hold to the contract. I will know when he understands, because the weight will lift. I do not know when this will be. It may be on the day I die. It may be on the day my granddaughter sits in a kitchen with him and writes the same sentence in her own diary, and the sentence lifts the weight by being written. The weight will lift. I am going to lay this diary down now and go to bed. Lars is dead. I am 18. I am going to be the responsible one in this family for a long time. Mr. Cantwell will help me, although he does not know it. I do not know it either. I am going to bed. Maren closed the diary. She held it in both hands. She did not cry. She had been trying not to cry for 9 months and had failed at it 3 times, and she did not, in this moment, want to fail at it. She was not, in fact, sad. She was, in a quiet way she had not yet had words for, the opposite of sad. She was on a bed in her grandmother's old room with a man she had known for 22 days, holding a 102-year-old diary in which her grandmother had written, the morning after her brother died, that the weight would lift on the day Maren would not lay it down until her hands could. She laid the diary down. She set it on the bed beside the muslin and the brass key and the open lockbox. She looked at Nate. Nate had his hands on his thighs. He was looking at the diary. He was not crying either. He was, in a quiet way, the opposite of sad. "All right," he said. "All right." She stood up. He stood up. They walked out of Astrid's old room and into the kitchen of the cottage. The cottage drawer was closed. The kettle was on the counter, upright. The hot plate was off. Maren walked to the drawer. She opened it. The drawer was empty. She closed it. The drawer stayed closed. They walked out of the cottage. Wendell was on the porch. Otto was at the barn doorway. Bryony's car was, when they came out, just pulling up in the gravel. Bryony got out of the car with 2 cardboard coffees from the kiosk and a paper bag of biscuits Maren had not asked for. She walked up the path. She did not, on the path, ask any questions. She had asked her questions over text on Wednesday night, and Maren had answered each of them with a single word, and Bryony had decided she was waiting for Sunday. It was Sunday. She handed Maren a coffee. She handed Nate the second coffee. She handed Maren the biscuits. "You both look like you have slept," she said. "Yes," Maren said. "That is the first time this has been true in 2 weeks." "Yes." "All right." She went into the office and put the kettle on the office burner. The kettle began to boil on the burner because the burner had been turned on. There was no charm to it. The kettle was a kettle. Aunt Tove arrived at noon. Birger and Sigrid arrived at 12:30 in human form, both of them, in the same pickup, both of them with their shirts on the right way around. Birger had brought a casserole. Sigrid had brought a 6-pack of beer. The casserole was edible. The beer was cold. The 6 of them, Maren, Nate, Bryony, Aunt Tove, Birger, Sigrid, sat at the kitchen table and ate. Anders was at the office in town by his own choice and not at the table. Anders had said on the phone Friday that he was glad and that he was not going to come up for the Sunday because the Sunday was for the family. Wendell, in the office doorway, exhaled. Aunt Tovey finished her plate. She set it down. She stood up. She walked to the office doorway. She put her hand on Wendell's neck. Wendell did not bite her. Wendell, in fact, lowered his head. Wendell pressed his forehead against Aunt Tove's left thigh, the same gesture he had given Nate on the first afternoon, and stayed there for a count of 6. Aunt Tove, who had been bitten by Wendell on the right shoulder in 2018 and had a small scar to commemorate the occasion, kept her hand on his neck for the count of 6. She did not press. She did not pet. She kept her hand there. Wendell turned and walked out to the bench on the porch and lay down. Aunt Tove came back to the table. She did not comment. "Aunt Tove," Sigrid said, sweet as a lemon drop. "How lovely." Birger lowered his fork. "Wendell actually let her," Bryony said, very softly. "He let her." Nate did not say anything. He had been holding his coffee in both hands the entire meal. Maren said, "He did." At 3, the table broke up. Bryony left for the kiosk. Birger and Sigrid left for the Magnusons. Aunt Tova left for her cove. Nate cleaned the kitchen. Maren washed the floor. By 4, the office was the office again. The cottage drawer opened one final time at 3:45. Maren was at the sink drying her hands when she heard it from across the yard. A small wood-on-wood note. She walked across the yard with the dish towel still in her hand. Nate met her at the cottage door. The drawer was open by an inch. Inside, lying flat, was a small white card. The card was the same blank, stiff white stock Mrs. Verleen Mott had left under the salt cellar 12 days ago. The same name and the same phone number were printed in the same small black letters. The difference was a stamp in the upper right corner, a square stamp in dark blue ink that read, "File closed," and below the stamp, in Mrs. Mott's careful hand in the same Bic pen, the Halvorsen Cantwell instrument of 1924 with codicil of 1962 is satisfied. The department thanks you for your cooperation. V.M. The bottom edge of the card carried, in a separate hand Maren did not recognize. Astrid would be pleased. Maren held the card by the corners. That second line is not in Mrs. Mott's hand. No. Anders Petrescu wrote it. Yes. Anders Petrescu has been a stakeholder in this contract since 1962 and has never said one thing about it, and his contribution to its closing is one line added to the bottom of someone else's card. That is very Anders. Yes. She set the card on the small table beside Nate's bed, beside the saucer that had appeared on the morning of the bluff. The drawer closed itself. The kettle on the cold burner remained on its side. The cottage did not, as far as either of them could tell, do anything else. They walked out of the cottage. Maren had her hand on Nate's coat sleeve. She had not done that before. "The bluff," she said. "Yes." They walked the path to Astrid's looking spot. They walked it slowly. Wendell did not follow, because Wendell had decided, at some point in the last week, that the bluff was Maren's place and Aunt Tove's place, and not his. The bluff at 4 was the gray gold of a Pacific Northwest May afternoon when the fog had not come up. The bay was quiet. The ferry was not yet visible. They stopped at the flat stone. She put her hands in her coat pockets. He put his hands in his coat pockets. They did not say anything for a while. The 4:30 ferry whistled, long, from the south. It cleared the breakwater. It came around the point. They watched it slide into the dock as the 4:30 ferry had slid into the dock every afternoon for 130 years. He took his right hand out of his coat pocket. He held it out to her, palm up. She took her right hand out of her coat pocket. She set her palm against his palm. He did not hold her wrist. He did not hold her by the corners. He did not hold her by the sides. He took her hand by the palm, by the meat of her palm against the meat of his, and he closed his fingers around hers, and his thumb settled on the back of her hand, and his palm and her palm held each other in the simplest grip two hands can take. They stood at the looking spot. The ferry docked. 2 cars came off the 4:30. The cars climbed the road past the post office. Bryony's brother, on the ferry, waved to no one in particular, and the wave was the gesture of a man who knew he was being watched from the bluff. Maren did not wave back. Nate did not let go of her hand. The fog began, finally, to come up. She did not look at the fog. She did not look at the ferry either, although she was conscious of it. She was conscious of the brass key in her coat pocket, and of the leather diary on the bed in the cottage, and of the muslin with the cross-stitched sentence, and of Wendell on the porch, lying down on his own initiative for the first time in 11 years. She was conscious of the kettle on the cold burner in the cottage kitchen, which was, when she had looked at it at 3, also on its side again, which was the cottage's way, finally, of saying it was at rest. The cottage was at rest. Nate held her hand. She held his hand. The fog came up over the bluff and softened the gold of the late afternoon, and the ferry pulled away from the dock and made its long, slow turn for the next harbor. And they stood at the looking spot for some time after that, with the bluff under them and the bay below and the cottage closed behind them, and Astrid's old kettle on its side on the cold burner, and the brass key in Maren's coat pocket, and the diary on the bed, and the weight finally lifted.
Thank you for listening. Please visit me at winvalentine.com to stay up to date. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and review.